In the heart of ancient Japan, where the mountains cradle a valley of whispers and moonlight, there once lived a city so beautiful that even the stars would pause to gaze upon it. This was Kyoto, the imperial capital, where emperors dreamed beneath gilded eaves, and where every shadow held a story, every breeze carried a secret, and every lantern glow promised something just beyond the veil of ordinary sight. The night air in old Kyoto had a particular quality to it, soft and cool like silk against the skin, fragrant with incense from 1,000 temple altars, and the sweet perfume of night-blooming flowers that opened their petals only when the sun had gone to rest. If you stood very still in one of the quiet gardens behind the palace walls, you could hear the bamboo stalks whispering to one another, their leaves rustling with ancient gossip, while somewhere in the distance a temple bell would ring once, twice, 3 times, marking the passage of hours that felt more like dreams than measured time. The city itself seemed to breathe with a rhythm all its own. During the day it was a place of ceremony and order, where nobles moved through prescribed rituals with the grace of dancers, performing steps they had learned from birth. But when darkness fell and the paper lanterns were lit, Kyoto transformed into something else entirely, a realm where the boundary between the seen and unseen grew thin as rice paper, where spirits walked alongside mortals, and where the most ordinary moment might suddenly reveal itself to be touched by magic. The palace compound at the city's heart was a world unto itself, surrounded by walls that kept out the noise of the common streets but could not keep out the moonlight, which spilled freely across the elegant rooftops with their upturned corners that seemed to reach toward the heavens. Within these walls lived the emperor and his court, hundreds of nobles and ladies, priests and scholars, servants and guards, all moving through their days and nights according to rules so complex and ancient that even they sometimes forgot why certain things must be done in certain ways, only knowing that they must. The nobles of the court wore robes of such exquisite beauty that they seemed more like walking artworks than mere clothing. Layer upon layer of silk, each colour carefully chosen to harmonise with the next, creating combinations that had names as poetic as they were precise. There was the layering called willow, where pale greens faded into deeper shades like leaves moving from new spring growth to summer fullness. There was cherry blossom, a cascade of whites and pinks that seemed to capture the very essence of those beloved flowers. And there was maple viewing, a symphony of reds and oranges that brought autumn's glory even into the depths of winter. But these beautiful robes were more than simple decoration. They were a language all their own, speaking volumes about the wearer's rank, their taste, their understanding of the subtle poetry that governed every aspect of court life. To see a lady moving through the palace corridors was to witness a silent conversation between her clothing and the season, between tradition and personal expression, between what was said and what was left delicately unspoken. The days at court followed patterns as precise as the movements in a tea ceremony. There were morning rituals when offerings were made to the ancestors and to the gods who watched over the imperial line. There were afternoon hours devoted to poetry composition, when nobles would gather in elegant pavilions to compose verses inspired by a dewdrop on a lotus leaf, or the particular way the light fell through the bamboo grove. There were evening gatherings where musicians played instruments that seemed to capture the sound of wind through pine trees or water flowing over stones, while dancers moved with gestures so refined that a single turn of the wrist could express an entire story of longing or loss. Yet beneath all this visible beauty and order, there flowed an undercurrent of mystery, a sense that the court existed on multiple levels at once. The nobles who smiled and bowed to one another in public might be engaged in intricate political maneuvers behind closed screens. A poem that seemed to be about cherry blossoms might actually be a coded message about forbidden love or dangerous alliances. A gift of carefully folded paper might carry meanings that only the recipient could fully understand. The ladies of the court moved through this world like elegant ghosts, their faces powdered white as moonlight, their teeth sometimes blackened in a fashion that marked them as married or of particularly high rank. They lived in quarters separated from the men by screens and curtains, existing in a realm of whispers and shadows where they wrote poetry in flowing scripts, practiced calligraphy until each brushstroke was perfect, and told one another stories that had been passed down through generations of women who had lived behind these same walls. These ladies knew secrets that the men did not. They knew which passages through the palace were safest for forbidden meetings, which servants could be trusted to carry messages, which nights the moon would be bright enough to read by, and which corners of the garden were said to be favoured by spirits. They knew that in the deep hours of the night, when even the guards were drowsy at their posts, strange things could happen in the old palace. Doors that had been closed would be found standing open. Music would drift from rooms that should have been empty. Footsteps would echo down corridors where no one walked. Some said these were the ghosts of emperors past, still walking the halls they had known in life. Others whispered that these were fox spirits, those magical kitsune who could take human form and who delighted in playing tricks on mortals. Still others believed that these were simply the natural sounds of an ancient building settling into itself, creaking and breathing like a living thing. But whatever the explanation, the mysterious sounds and sights added to the sense that the palace was a place where the ordinary rules of the world did not fully apply. The emperor himself lived at the very centre of this elaborate world, a figure so sacred that most of his subjects would never see his face. He was considered a living god, a descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, and his person was hedged about with so many taboos and protocols that his daily life was almost entirely prescribed by ritual. He could not simply walk where he wished or speak to whom he pleased. Every action, from the moment he woke until the moment he retired to sleep, was governed by ancient customs that had accumulated over centuries like layers of silk in a noblewoman's robe. Yet even for one so exalted, or perhaps especially for one so exalted, there must have been moments of profound loneliness, times when the weight of all that ceremony and tradition felt less like an honour than a beautiful cage. The emperor sat on his throne and received the bows of his courtiers, and perhaps sometimes he wondered what it would be like to simply walk through his capital as an ordinary person, to see the world as others saw it, unfiltered through the elaborate protocols that surrounded him like a cocoon. The palace where he lived was a marvel of architecture, with buildings connected by covered walkways that allowed the nobles to move from one part of the complex to another without being exposed to rain or sun. The roofs were made of cypress bark, laid in overlapping layers that would last for decades before needing replacement. The pillars that supported these roofs were made of massive timbers, left natural and unpainted, their wood grain visible and beautiful in its simplicity. The floors were of polished wood that glowed softly in the light of oil lamps and candles, reflecting the movements of those who walked upon them like a still pool of water. But for all its elegance, the palace had its dark corners too, places where the light did not quite reach, rooms that were seldom used and which gathered shadows like cobwebs. There were storage rooms filled with treasures from centuries past, scrolls and paintings and robes that had belonged to emperors and empresses long dead. There were forgotten staircases that led to parts of the palace that no one could quite remember the purpose of. There were gardens that had been allowed to grow wild, where the carefully pruned trees had sent out unruly branches and where the moss had crept across the stepping stones until they were more green than grey. These were the places where the mysterious side of palace life seemed most present, where a serving girl hurrying through with a tray of tea things might catch a glimpse of something that made her heart race, a figure in old-fashioned robes disappearing around a corner, or the sound of sobbing coming from a room that she knew to be empty. These were the places where even the bravest samurai guard might feel a chill run down his spine, where the air itself seemed to thicken with unseen presences. Among the most mysterious figures in palace life were the court on Myoji, those practitioners of esoteric arts who served as the emperor's spiritual advisors and protectors. These men were masters of yin-yang cosmology, able to read the movements of stars and planets, to divine auspicious and inauspicious days, to create protective talismans and perform rituals that would ward off evil influences. They wore distinctive tall black hats and robes marked with mysterious symbols, and when they walked through the palace corridors, even high-ranking nobles would step aside to let them pass. The most famous of all on Myoji was Abe no Saimei, who had lived during the Heian period and whose legendary powers were spoken of for centuries after his death. Stories said that Saimei could see spirits invisible to ordinary people, that he could command demons to do his bidding, that he had once created magical servants from scraps of paper who could perform tasks as well as any human. Whether these tales were literally true, or whether they were poetic exaggerations of real abilities, they spoke to the very real awe and fear with which such practitioners were regarded. Saimei was said to have protected the capital from countless supernatural threats. There was the story of how he had banished a powerful demon that had been plaguing the palace, causing illness and misfortune. He had performed an elaborate ritual involving sacred fires and ancient incantations, calling upon the gods to lend their power, until finally the demon had been forced to depart, fleeing into the mountains where it could no longer harm anyone. There was another tale of how Saimei had created a barrier of spiritual protection around the entire city, invisible walls of power that kept the worst evils at bay while allowing benevolent spirits to pass through freely. The Onmyoji were not the only spiritual specialists at court. There were also Buddhist monks who served as court chaplains, performing rituals for the emperor's health and longevity, for the prosperity of the realm, for the repose of departed souls. These monks came from the great temple complexes that surrounded Kyoto, bringing with them the weight and authority of their ancient institutions. They chanted sutras in rooms thick with incense smoke, their deep voices resonating through the wooden halls, creating an atmosphere of solemn power. There were Shinto priests as well, maintaining the shrines within the palace compound, performing purification rituals, presiding over ceremonies that connected the emperor to his divine ancestors. These priests wore white robes of the purest silk, and they moved through their duties with a grave precision that spoke of practices unchanged for countless generations. They understood that every gesture, every word, every offering mattered, that the relationship between the imperial house and the gods was maintained through these careful observances. But beyond these official religious figures, there were also informal practitioners of various mysterious arts. There were women who could read fortunes in the patterns of tea leaves, men who claimed to be able to communicate with the dead, elderly people who knew the old folk magic that had been practiced long before Buddhism came to Japan. These people existed on the margins of court life, sometimes called upon when other methods had failed, sometimes consulted in secret by nobles who would not want to admit their interest in such things. The palace gardens were themselves places of profound mystery and beauty. These were not gardens in the Western sense, wild and profuse with flowers. Rather, They were carefully composed landscapes where every stone, every tree, every patch of moss had been placed with exquisite care to create scenes of natural beauty that were actually the result of meticulous human art. To walk through these gardens was to move through a succession of perfectly framed views, each one a living painting that changed with the seasons and the time of day. There were gardens designed around ponds where koi fish drifted like living jewels beneath the water's surface, where turtles sunned themselves on carefully placed rocks, where lotus flowers bloomed in summer with their pure white petals emerging unstained from the muddy depths. The nobles would sit in pavilions overlooking these ponds, watching the play of light on water, composing poems about the reflection of the moon, or the way a single leaf floated on the surface like a tiny boat. There were dry gardens too, composed entirely of rocks and carefully raked gravel, representing islands in an ocean, or mountains rising above clouds. These gardens were meant for contemplation rather than strolling, and they possessed a austere beauty that spoke to deep Buddhist ideas about the nature of reality and illusion. To gaze upon such a garden was to see both the physical arrangement of stones and something beyond, some glimpse of the underlying order and emptiness that Buddhism taught was the true nature of all things. And then there were the moss gardens, where dozens of different varieties created carpets of green in every imaginable shade, from the palest yellow-green to the deepest emerald. These gardens were particularly beautiful after rain, when the moss seemed to glow with an inner light, when every surface was jewelled with water droplets. To walk through such a garden on soft slippers, hearing only the sound of water dripping from leaves and the distant call of birds, was to enter a realm of perfect peace and tranquillity. But these gardens also had their mysterious side. In the early morning, when mist rose from the ponds and hung among the trees, the gardens seemed to exist between worlds, not quite real and not quite dream. Strange sounds would sometimes echo through the mist, sounds that might have been birds or might have been something else entirely. Gardeners working in the pre-dawn hours would sometimes report seeing figures moving through the fog, figures that vanished when approached, leaving only a sense of presence and the faint scent of flowers. There were particular spots in the gardens that were known to be favoured by spirits. A certain stone lantern where offerings of rice and sake would sometimes appear, though no one had seen them being placed. A particular bridge over a stream where people reported feeling watched, though no one was ever visible. A grove of bamboo where the rustling of the leaves sometimes sounded eerily like voices having a conversation just too quiet to make out the words. The nights in these gardens could be particularly mysterious. When the moon was full, its light would transform everything, turning the familiar into something strange and beautiful. Shadows would become deep pools of darkness, while moonlit surfaces would glow with an almost unearthly radiance. The nobles sometimes held moon-viewing parties in the gardens, gathering to admire the moon's reflection in the pond, to compose poetry celebrating its beauty, to drink sake and eat special foods prepared for the occasion. But they were also careful not to venture too far into the gardens at night, not to stray from the well-lit paths near the buildings, for it was believed that after dark the gardens belonged as much to spirits as to humans, that one might encounter things best left undisturbed. There were stories of nobles who had wandered too deep into the garden at night and had become lost, turning in circles for hours before finally finding their way back, unable to explain how they could have lost their way in a garden they knew perfectly well by day. The temples of Kyoto were places where the mysterious dimension of life was openly acknowledged and worked with, where priests and monks dedicated their lives to understanding and navigating the unseen world. The great temple complexes were like cities within the city, with multiple halls and pagodas, meditation rooms and libraries, gardens and guest houses, all maintained by communities of hundreds or even thousands of monks. The main halls of these temples were architectural marvels, massive wooden structures built without a single nail, their huge pillars and beams fitted together with such precision that they had stood for centuries, surviving earthquakes and typhoons. Inside these halls the atmosphere was thick with incense smoke and the lingering resonance of countless chanted prayers. The light that filtered through paper screens was soft and golden, falling on statues of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas whose serene faces seemed to gaze out with infinite compassion on all who entered. These statues themselves were objects of great mystery and power, the largest ones as carved from single massive trees, the work of master sculptors who had dedicated years to their creation. Others had been cast in bronze using techniques that required not just technical skill, but also spiritual preparation and purification. The eyes of these statues were often inlaid with crystal or glass, and in the flickering light of oil lamps they seemed almost alive, following visitors as they moved through the hall. There were stories of these statues performing miracles. A famous statue of Kannon, the Bodhisattva of compassion, was said to have wept tears of blood when a great disaster was about to befall the capital, warning people to take precautions. Another statue was said to have spoken aloud to a monk who was struggling with doubts, its voice like distant thunder, offering words of encouragement that restored the monk's faith. A statue of Fudo Myu, the fierce protector deity, was reported to have saved a temple from fire by creating a wall of water that the flames could not pass. The monks who served in these temples rose before dawn to begin their practice. They would gather in the main hall for morning prayers, chanting sutras in unison, their voices creating a deep harmonic sound that seemed to resonate not just in the hall but in the very earth itself. After prayers there would be meditation, sitting in perfect stillness on cushions arranged in neat rows, seeking that state of deep awareness that Buddhist practice cultivated. But the monks' understanding of their practice was that it was not just about personal enlightenment. They saw themselves as spiritual guardians of the capital and the nation, their prayers and rituals creating a protective field of spiritual power. They performed ceremonies to ensure good harvests, to avert natural disasters, to protect the emperor and the imperial house. They believed that their practice benefited all beings, human and non-human alike, spreading merit and compassion throughout the universe. The temple libraries contained vast collections of sacred texts, sutras copied by hand over centuries, commentaries written by great teachers, records of dreams and visions experienced by monks in deep meditation. These texts were treated with utmost reverence, stored in special fireproof repositories, handled only with clean hands and a pure heart. To study these texts was to connect with the wisdom of countless generations of seekers, to participate in a conversation that stretched back through time to the Buddha himself. Some of these texts described realms and beings that existed beyond ordinary human perception. There were descriptions of pure lands, paradises where enlightened beings dwelled, surrounded by beautiful gardens and celestial music, where suffering did not exist, and where all who arrived would eventually achieve full awakening. There were accounts of the various hells, terrifying realms where beings suffered the karmic consequences of evil actions, though even these were understood not as eternal punishments, but as temporary states from which liberation was ultimately possible. There were texts that described the complex cosmology of Buddhism, with its countless world systems, its vast cycles of time measured in kalpa so long that they made historical time seem like the blink of an eye. There were teachings about the nature of mind and consciousness, about the relationship between wisdom and compassion, about the practices that could lead to the direct realization of truth that went beyond all words and concepts. The pagodas that rose above the temple complexes were themselves mysterious structures, their multiple tiers ascending toward the heavens like prayers made solid and visible. These towers housed sacred relics, fragments of bone or ash said to have come from the Buddha himself or from great Buddhist masters. The presence of these relics was believed to sanctify the entire area, to create a field of spiritual power that protected and blessed all who came near. At night, these pagodas were sometimes lit by lanterns, their silhouettes visible from far across the city, reminders that the Buddhist teaching stood watch over Kyoto even in the darkest hours. The wind chimes that hung from the corners of each tier would ring softly in the breeze, their sound thought to purify the air and please the gods. And sometimes, on particularly clear nights, people looking up at these pagodas would report seeing strange lights hovering around their tops, lights that seemed to dance and shimmer, that some said were the spirits of enlightened beings come to pay their respects. The Shinto shrines of Kyoto were different in character from the Buddhist temples, but they were no less mysterious. While temples were often grand and imposing, shrines could be found in all sizes, from the great sanctuaries that occupied large compounds to tiny shrines tucked into corners of neighborhoods, marked only by a small torii gate and a simple altar where residents would leave offerings of rice and sake. The torii gates that mark the entrances to shrines were one of the most distinctive features of the Kyoto landscape. These simple structures, usually painted in vermilion red, consisted of two upright pillars topped by two crossbars. To pass through a torii was to cross a boundary, to move from the ordinary world into sacred space. Even the smallest shrine demanded this recognition, this acknowledgement that one was entering a realm where the kami dwelled and where proper respect must be shown. The great shrines of Kyoto were places of tremendous spiritual power. The Fushimi Inari shrine, with its thousands of vermilion torii gates forming tunnels through the forest as they wound up the mountainside, was perhaps the most visually striking. To walk through those tunnels of gates was to have an experience that was almost overwhelming, the repeated red frames creating a pulsing rhythm, the path seeming to lead not just up a mountain, but into some other dimension entirely. This shrine was dedicated to Inari, the god of rice and prosperity, and it was attended by statues of foxes, those mysterious animals who were seen as Inari's messengers or servants. These fox statues sat in pairs, one with mouth open, one with mouth closed, representing the beginning and end of all things. They wore red bibs that had been left by worshippers, and their eyes seemed to follow visitors as they passed. At night, people sometimes reported seeing real foxes moving through the shrine grounds, appearing and disappearing like ghosts, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. The Shimogamo and Kamigamo shrines, dedicated to the thunder god and his relatives, were set in primeval forest that had somehow survived the growth of the city around it. To enter these shrine precincts was to step back in time, to walk beneath trees that had stood for hundreds of years, to follow paths that had been trod by countless pilgrims over the centuries. The shrines themselves were elegant and austere, their architecture exemplifying the Shinto aesthetic of pure simplicity. These shrines were the sites of important festivals throughout the year. The Aoi Matsuri, one of Kyoto's three great festivals, featured a grand procession from the Imperial Palace to these shrines, with participants dressed in the style of the Heian Court, reenacting ceremonies that had been performed for over 1,000 years. To witness this procession was to see history come alive, to understand how the past remained present in Kyoto in ways that went beyond mere memory. But shrines were not just sites of formal ceremonies and festivals. They were also places where ordinary people came with their everyday concerns and hopes. A merchant might visit a shrine before undertaking a new business venture, asking for the god's blessing and protection. A mother might bring her newborn child to be presented to the local kami and placed under divine guardianship. A student might leave an offering before important examinations, hoping for success. An elderly person might come to give thanks for a long life and to pray for a peaceful passing when the time came. The rituals performed at shrines had a beautiful simplicity. Visitors would first purify themselves at a water pavilion, using a long-handled ladle to pour water over their hands and to rinse their mouth. Then they would approach the main shrine building, making a small offering of coins by tossing them into a collection box. They would pull on a thick rope to ring a bell, alerting the kami to their presence. Then they would bow twice, clap their hands twice, and bow once more, a sequence of gestures that had been performed millions of times over the centuries. But behind this simple ritual lay complex beliefs about the nature of the kami and their relationship with humans. The kami were understood to be fundamentally different from humans, powerful beings who inhabited a realm that overlapped with, but was not identical to the ordinary world. They were neither all good nor all powerful in the way that the gods of some religions were conceived to be. Instead, they were beings with their own personalities and preferences, who could be generous and helpful, but who could also be angry and harmful if not shown proper respect. The sacred ropes called shimenawa that marked off sacred spaces were believed to create actual boundaries that separated the pure from the impure, the sacred from the profane. These ropes, made of rice straw and decorated with zigzag paper streamers, could be seen draped across torii gates, hung around ancient trees, stretched across the entrances to shrine buildings. They were magical borders, invisible walls that protected sacred space and kept negative influences at bay. There were places in and around Kyoto where the power of the kami seemed particularly strong, places that were recognized as sacred long before any shrine was built there. These might be unusual rock formations, ancient trees, waterfalls, or mountain tops. At these places, the boundary between the seen and unseen felt especially thin, and people reported having experiences that defied ordinary explanation. One such place was a grove of massive cryptomeria trees that stood near one of the mountain shrines. These trees were hundreds of years old, their trunks so thick that several people linking hands could not reach around them. Their upper branches were lost in perpetual shadow, creating a gloom that persisted even on the sunniest days. To walk among these trees was to feel simultaneously small and connected to something vast and ancient. People spoke of hearing voices in the rustling of the needles, of seeing lights moving between the trunks, of feeling presences that seemed to be observing them though nothing visible could be seen. Another sacred spot was a waterfall that tumbled down a cliff face in one of the mountain valleys. The water fell from a height of perhaps 50 feet, crashing into a pool below with a constant roar that drowned out all other sounds. Ascetic monks would sometimes practice beneath this waterfall, standing in the frigid water as it pounded down on their heads and shoulders, using the physical ordeal as a means of spiritual purification and training. Those who performed this practice reported experiencing visions and insights, moments of clarity that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. The mountains themselves that surrounded Kyoto were understood to be sacred, dwelling places of gods and enlightened beings, realms where the natural and supernatural merged. Mount Hiei to the northeast was home to the great Enryakuji temple complex, thousands of monks who maintained a constant cycle of practice and ritual that was believed to protect the capital from evil influences coming from that unlucky direction. The mountain itself was seen as a living presence, a guardian that watched over the city spread out below. On foggy days, when clouds obscured the mountain's peak, it seemed to float above the world, no longer quite connected to the earth. On clear nights, the lights from the temple buildings could be seen twinkling like earth-bound stars, a visible reminder of the spiritual work being done there. And sometimes, particularly in the early morning or late evening, strange lights would be seen moving on the mountainside, lights that followed no path and that appeared and disappeared with no apparent pattern. Some said these were the lanterns of monks moving between buildings, but others believed they were foxfire or the manifestations of spiritual beings. The ghosts of Kyoto were as much a part of the city as its living inhabitants. Every old house, every temple, every street corner had its stories of supernatural encounters, tales that were told and retold, embellished with each telling but retaining a core of experience that many people could relate to. These were not abstract stories about unknown people in distant places. These were accounts of experiences that had happened to neighbours, to family members, to people one might meet in the market or see at a festival. The most common type of ghost was the yurei, the spirit of someone who had died with strong emotions left unresolved, or with important business left unfinished. These spirits appeared as pale figures in white burial robes, their long black hair hanging loose and dishevelled, their hands hanging limply before them. They had no feet, floating above the ground as they drifted through the night. Their faces were masks of sorrow or rage or longing, frozen in whatever emotion had bound them to the earthly realm. Some yurei appeared at the places where they had died, particularly if the death had been violent or untimely. A woman murdered by a jealous lover might appear at the site of her death, weeping and calling out his name. A samurai killed in battle might appear on the anniversary of his death, still fighting invisible enemies. A child who had died of illness might be seen playing in the garden where they had played in life, vanishing when approached. Other yurei were bound to specific people rather than places. They might appear to those who had wronged them in life, demanding justice or revenge. They might appear to loved ones, unable to let go of the connections that had defined their earthly existence. They might appear to complete strangers, seeking help to resolve whatever was keeping them from finding peace. There was a famous story about a yurei who had appeared night after night to a samurai who had promised to marry her, but had broken his word. She came to him in his dreams, and then began appearing when he was awake, always watching him with sorrowful eyes, never speaking but making her presence felt. The samurai tried everything to escape her. He moved to different houses, travelled to different cities, even became a monk and entered a monastery. But still she appeared, her presence growing stronger rather than weaker with time. Finally, in desperation, he sought help from a famous monk who performed elaborate rituals and convinced the ghost to speak. She revealed that she would not leave until he fulfilled his promise or until he died. The samurai, seeing no other choice, left the monastery and spent the rest of his life making offerings at her grave and performing good works in her name, and only after his death did she finally disappear. Another type of ghost was the onryo, the vengeful spirit of someone who had died with great anger or resentment. These spirits were particularly dangerous, capable of causing illness, accidents, and even death to those they held responsible for their suffering. The most famous onryo in Japanese history was Sugawara no Michizane, a brilliant scholar and politician who'd been falsely accused of crimes and exiled from Kyoto. He died in exile, and after his death, a series of disasters struck the capital: lightning storms, floods, plagues, and the deaths of several of his political enemies. These were all attributed to his angry spirit seeking revenge. To appease this powerful Onryo, Michizane was posthumously pardoned and elevated to divine status as Tenjin, the god of learning. Shrines were built in his honour, and he came to be revered rather than feared. This transformation from vengeful ghost to benevolent deity showed how the people of Kyoto understood that even the most fearsome supernatural beings could be placated through proper respect and ritual. But not all supernatural encounters in Kyoto involved ghosts. There were also stories of living people who had mysterious experiences, moments when reality seemed to shift and reveal something beyond the ordinary. A merchant walking home late at night might turn a corner and find himself in a street he had never seen before, though he knew the neighbourhood perfectly. He would walk for what felt like hours, growing increasingly confused and frightened, before suddenly recognising where he was and realising that only a few minutes had passed. A noble lady looking out her window might see a procession passing in the street below, a wedding party in old-fashioned dress, everyone moving in perfect silence. She would watch as they passed, and then they would simply vanish, melting into air, leaving her wondering if she had seen a memory from the past or a glimpse into some other dimension of reality. A child playing in a garden might encounter another child who seemed somehow strange, who knew games that had been forgotten for generations, who spoke in an old-fashioned way. They would play together for an afternoon, and then the strange child would say they had to go home, and they would walk through a garden wall as if it were not there, leaving the first child staring at solid stone and wondering if they had dreamed the whole encounter. These experiences were accepted as part of life in Kyoto, not as signs of madness or delusion, but as genuine encounters with the mysterious dimension of existence. People understood that the world was larger and stranger than ordinary perception revealed, and they were not surprised when that strangeness occasionally manifested in direct and undeniable ways. The seasonal cycle brought its own mysteries and magic to Kyoto. Each season had its own character, its own special beauty, its own associated spirits and supernatural phenomena. The changing of the seasons was marked with special attention and ceremony, recognized as one of the great rhythms that structured existence. Spring came to Kyoto in a gradual transformation that began with the blooming of plum blossoms in late winter. These early flowers, with their sweet fragrance and delicate petals, were celebrated as the first sign that winter's grip was loosening. Nobles would hold plum viewing parties, gathering in gardens where the trees were in bloom, composing poems that praised the flowers' courage in blooming while the weather was still cold, comparing their steadfastness to that of loyal friends or faithful lovers. But the true glory of spring was the cherry blossoms, those beloved sakura that bloomed in a cascade of pink and white that transformed entire hillsides and turned the streets of Kyoto into tunnels of petals. The blooming of the cherry trees was eagerly anticipated, with people watching for the first buds to open, tracking the progress of the blossoms from the warmer southern parts of Japan as they moved northward with the warming season. When the cherries finally bloomed in Kyoto, it was a time of great celebration. Families would pack elaborate picnic lunches and spend entire days sitting beneath the flowering trees, eating and drinking, composing poetry, enjoying the company of friends and loved ones. At night, some of the famous cherry viewing spots would be lit with lanterns, allowing the celebrations to continue after dark, the white petals seeming to glow in the lamplight like snow or like stars fallen to earth. But the cherry blossoms bloomed for only a brief time, usually less than 2 weeks, and this transience made them all the more precious. When the petals began to fall, it was considered deeply moving, a visible demonstration of the Buddhist teaching about impermanence. The nobles would write poems about how the falling petals were like snow, like tears, like time itself slipping away. They understood that beauty was heightened by its brevity, that to fully appreciate something one had to accept that it would not last. There was also a sadness to cherry blossom season, a melancholy that was considered an essential part of its beauty. This was the emotion of mono no aware, that gentle sorrow at the transience of all beautiful things, that recognition that everything precious must eventually pass away. To feel mono no aware was to be truly alive to beauty, to open one's heart fully to experience, even knowing that doing so meant also opening oneself to loss. Spring was also a time when spirits were particularly active. The warmth and growth of spring was believed to energize not just the visible world of plants and animals, but also the invisible world of ghosts and spirits. There were reports of ghostly processions seen at dawn or dusk, of mysterious music heard in empty buildings, of encounters with beautiful women who vanished like morning mist when approached. The summer in Kyoto brought intense heat and humidity, transforming the city into a place where even the smallest movement required effort, where nobles retreated to the coolest parts of their houses and tried to find relief through the arrangement of their living spaces. Screens were removed to allow whatever breeze there might be to pass through rooms. Gardens were designed to create the illusion of coolness, with streams and waterfalls, with plants chosen for their association with water and shade. The Great Gion Festival took place in the height of summer, a month-long celebration that culminated in a grand procession of enormous floats through the streets of Kyoto. This festival had originated as a ritual to appease the gods and drive away the diseases that flourished in the summer heat, but it had evolved into one of the great spectacles of Japanese culture, a time when the entire city seemed to come alive with colour and music and excitement. The floats themselves were massive structures, some as tall as buildings, decorated with beautiful tapestries and carvings, topped with spires and banners that swayed as the floats moved. They were pulled through the streets by teams of men who chanted rhythmic calls to coordinate their efforts, while musicians rode on the floats playing traditional festival music that could be heard echoing through the city. But summer also brought its own supernatural phenomena. The fireflies that appeared in vast numbers along the rivers and in the gardens were seen as somehow magical, their blinking lights neither quite animal nor quite spirit. People believed these might be the souls of the dead, come back to visit the world of the living, or perhaps they were tiny nature spirits, celebrating the warm nights in their own way. There were also summer storms, spectacular displays of lightning and thunder that would roll across Kyoto with tremendous power. These storms were believed to be caused by dragons or by gods of thunder and rain, and people would watch them with a mixture of fear and awe, understanding that they were witnessing forces far beyond human control. Summer nights could be eerie too. The heat made it difficult to sleep, and people would lie awake listening to the sounds of the night, the cicadas singing their endless songs, the occasional cry of a night bird, the creaking of wooden houses expanding and contracting in the changing temperature. And sometimes there would be sounds that had no clear explanation. Footsteps on paths when no one was walking, voices calling when no one was there, music drifting from directions where no musicians played. Autumn came as a relief after summer's oppressive heat, bringing cooler temperatures and clearer skies. The autumn sky in Kyoto was particularly beautiful, a deep blue that seemed almost infinite, with clouds that looked painted against its perfect surface. The nobles would spend hours gazing at this sky, finding in it a sense of depth and clarity that matched the season's character. The autumn moon was considered the most beautiful of the year, and moon viewing parties were held on the nights when the moon was full. These gatherings were quieter and more contemplative than the cherry viewing parties of spring, reflecting autumn's more introspective mood. People would sit in darkened gardens, watching the moon rise, composing poetry that compared its beauty to white jade, to a perfect mirror, to the face of enlightenment itself. The changing of the maple leaves was autumn's great visual spectacle. The leaves would turn brilliant shades of red and orange and yellow, creating scenes of stunning beauty throughout Kyoto and in the mountains surrounding the city. People would make pilgrimages to famous spots for viewing the autumn colours, travelling for days to see particular groves of trees that were renowned for their beauty. But autumn was also a time of preparation for winter, a season of harvest and gathering, of making ready for the cold months ahead. There was a sense of urgency to autumn, a recognition that this beautiful time would not last, that winter was coming and provisions must be made. This gave autumn a poignant quality, beautiful but tinged with the knowledge of coming scarcity and cold. Autumn was traditionally associated with sadness and longing, with the emotion of melancholy that came from recognizing that all things must pass. The nobles would write poems about autumn that spoke of loneliness, of missing loved ones who were far away, of the years passing and youth fading like the maple leaves. But this sadness was not depression or despair. It was a refined emotion, a way of acknowledging the truth of impermanence while also finding beauty in that very truth. Winter in Kyoto could be harsh, with cold that penetrated the wooden buildings no matter how many layers of silk one wore, with occasional snow that transformed the city into a landscape of stark and austere beauty. The nobles would huddle around charcoal braziers, wearing robes lined with silk floss for warmth, drinking hot sake to warm themselves from within. Snow in Kyoto was considered particularly beautiful, perhaps because it was not common enough to become merely a difficulty to be endured. When snow did fall, it would blanket the city in silence, muffling all sounds, creating a sense of isolation and peace. The temples and shrines would be transformed, their roofs and gardens white, their distinctive shapes picked out in snow like ink paintings come to life. Winter was also a time of purification and renewal. The cold was seen as cleansing, burning away impurities, leaving things clean and stark. The New Year celebrations, which took place in the depths of winter, were times of thorough cleaning and purification, when everything was scrubbed and renewed, when old debts were paid and old quarrels were settled, when people tried to start fresh. But winter could also be dangerous. The cold could kill, especially the elderly and the poor who had no way to keep warm. Travellers caught in winter storms might freeze to death, and their ghosts were said to haunt the places where they had died, appearing to other travellers as warnings. There were stories of snow women, beautiful but deadly spirits who appeared during blizzards, who would lead men astray until they froze, or who would drain the life from them with a frozen touch. The winter solstice was particularly significant, the shortest day and longest night of the year, a time when the balance between light and dark tilted furthest toward darkness before beginning its slow shift back toward light. This night was believed to be especially dangerous, a time when malevolent spirits were strongest, when protective rituals were most necessary. Families would gather together, keeping lights burning through the long night, staying awake and alert until dawn came and the danger had passed. The New Year, which came shortly after the solstice, was a time of great ritual significance. Everything was renewed and purified. Houses were cleaned thoroughly, every corner swept, every surface dusted. Special foods were prepared according to recipes that had been passed down through generations. Offerings were made at family altars and at neighborhood shrines. The first sunrise of the new year was considered particularly auspicious, and many people would rise before dawn to watch it, making wishes and prayers for the year ahead. The daily life of ordinary people in Kyoto was interwoven with mystery and spiritual awareness in ways that might seem strange to modern sensibilities. Every action, from waking in the morning to retiring at night, could be an occasion for ritual acknowledgement of the unseen world. Before eating, a moment of gratitude to the gods and to the spirits of the food itself. Before leaving the house, a prayer for safety. Before undertaking any important activity, consultation of the calendar to determine if the day was auspicious. The common people of Kyoto lived lives that were hard and uncertain. They worked long hours, often at physically demanding labour, and they had little in the way of luxury or leisure. But they also had their own spiritual resources, their own ways of understanding and coping with the difficulties and uncertainties of life. They had their neighbourhood shrines where they could make offerings and prayers. They had their seasonal festivals that provided breaks from routine and opportunities for celebration. They had their stories and beliefs that helped make sense of a world that often seemed harsh and unfair. The merchants of Kyoto were a particularly interesting group, officially ranked low in the social hierarchy, but often wealthy and influential in practice. They ran shops selling all manner of goods, from basic necessities like rice and vegetables to luxury items like fine silk and imported treasures. They were skilled at reading people, at knowing what someone wanted before they themselves knew it, at making connections and facilitating exchanges. But merchants were also participants in the city's spiritual life. They made offerings at Ebisu shrines, asking the god of commerce for success in business. They consulted fortune tellers before making major decisions. They told and retold stories of successful merchants who had been helped by gods or spirits in disguise, and of foolish merchants who'd offended supernatural beings and suffered for it. There was a famous story about a rice merchant who had been on the verge of bankruptcy when an old woman came to his shop and asked to buy rice on credit. He had agreed, though he could ill afford it, because she reminded him of his own grandmother. The next day, she returned and paid him not just what she owed, but 10 times as much, saying that he had shown kindness when he had least to spare. She then revealed herself to be a manifestation of Inari, the god of rice and prosperity, and from that day forward, the merchant's business flourished. The artisans of Kyoto were creators of beauty and utility both. There were sword makers whose blades were prized throughout Japan for their sharpness and strength. There were ceramicists who created tea bowls that were treasured as works of art. There were weavers who produced silk of such quality that it seemed to glow with its own light. There were paper makers, dyers, carpenters, lacquer workers, and countless other specialists, each dedicated to perfecting their particular craft. These artisans understood their work as having a spiritual dimension. The creation of a beautiful object was not just a commercial transaction, but an act of devotion, a way of honouring the materials and the spirits that dwelt in them. A sword maker would purify himself before beginning work, would make offerings to the gods of the forge, would work in a state of focused concentration that was almost meditative. The resulting blade was not just a weapon, but a spiritual object, imbued with the dedication and skill of its maker. The tea bowls created by Kyoto's potters were objects of particular spiritual significance. In the tea ceremony, the bowl was more than just a vessel for drinking. It was an expression of aesthetic values, a manifestation of principles like simplicity, naturalness, and the beauty of imperfection. A truly great tea bowl had a presence that went beyond mere physical form, a quality that experienced tea practitioners could sense even without seeing the bowl, simply by holding it in their hands. The world of literature and art in Kyoto was deeply connected to the mysterious dimension of existence. Writers and painters sought to capture in their work not just the surface appearance of things but their deeper essence, the quality that made them more than just objects or phenomena. This required a kind of seeing that went beyond ordinary vision, an ability to perceive the spiritual or essential nature that underlay the physical form. The greatest work of Heian period literature, The Tale of Genji, was filled with references to supernatural elements and spiritual beliefs. Ghosts appeared, spirits possessed people, dreams revealed hidden truths, Buddhist and Shinto beliefs shaped characters' understanding of their experiences. But these elements were not presented as extraordinary or even particularly unusual. They were simply part of the fabric of life, as natural as the changing seasons or the progression from birth to death. The poetry composed by Kyoto's nobles and poets often dealt with themes of transience, longing, and the mysterious connections between the natural world and human emotion. A poem about autumn leaves might also be about the passage of time and the approach of death. A poem about a cuckoo's cry might be about separation from a loved one. The natural images were not just decorative but carried deep symbolic and emotional meanings that readers were expected to recognize and respond to. Painting in Kyoto developed its own distinctive aesthetic, emphasizing suggestion over explicit depiction, leaving space for the viewer's imagination to complete the image. A painting might show a landscape emerging from mist, with only a few elements clearly visible, the rest implied rather than shown. This aesthetic was influenced by Zen Buddhism's emphasis on direct intuition, rather than intellectual understanding, on the moment of sudden insight rather than gradual comprehension. The practice of flower arrangement, ikebana, was understood as a spiritual discipline as well as an aesthetic one. To arrange flowers was to create a temporary sculpture that expressed the arranger's understanding of beauty, nature, and the relationships between living things. Each flower and branch had meaning, both symbolic and aesthetic. The way they were positioned relative to one another created a composition that told a story, or expressed an emotion, or simply presented a moment of perfect balance and harmony. There were schools of ikebana with different philosophies and approaches, but all shared certain fundamental principles. The arrangement should look natural even though it was carefully constructed. It should reflect the season in which it was created. It should express the principle of asymmetry, avoiding perfect balance or regular patterns. It should leave space, recognizing that emptiness was as important as form, and it should be created with full attention and presence, the act of arrangement itself a form of meditation. The incense ceremony, kodo, was another refined art practiced in Kyoto. This was not simply a matter of burning incense for its pleasant smell, but of cultivating the ability to distinguish between different varieties of aromatic woods, each with its own subtle character. Participants would smell samples of rare and precious incenses, trying to identify them correctly, competing not for prizes but for the honor of demonstrating their refinement and learning. Different incenses were associated with different seasons, different times of day, different moods and occasions. There was summer incense, cool and refreshing like a breeze over water. There was winter incense, warm and deep like the smell of ancient wood. There was incense for meditation, for ceremonies, for simply enjoying the passing moment. To become skilled in the incense ceremony required years of practice and study, developing a sensitivity that could distinguish nuances that others might never perceive. the world of women in Kyoto was complex and multifaceted. Noble women lived very restricted lives in many ways, confined to their quarters, separated from men by screens and curtains, their movements and activities carefully regulated. But within these restrictions, they created rich inner lives and exercised subtle forms of power and influence. The ladies of the court were highly educated, trained in calligraphy and poetry, in music and painting, in the complex rules of etiquette that governed every aspect of social interaction. They wrote some of the greatest works of Japanese literature, including The Tale of Genji and The Pillow Book, works that revealed deep psychological insight and acute observation of human nature. These women communicated with one another and with the men of the court primarily through poetry and letters. The quality of one's handwriting was considered a reflection of character, and great care was taken in choosing the right paper, the right ink, the right words to express one's meaning with appropriate subtlety and indirection. A love affair might be conducted entirely through the exchange of poems, with meanings layered and implications left delicately unspoken. But women in Kyoto were not all nobles living in palace luxury. There were also women who worked as servants, as entertainers, as craftspeople, as merchants. These women had more freedom of movement than their noble counterparts, but also far less security and comfort. They navigated a world that was often difficult and sometimes dangerous, relying on their wits and their connections to survive and perhaps prosper. The geisha and courtesans of Kyoto occupied a particularly complex position. They were admired for their beauty and accomplishments, sought after by wealthy and powerful men. The most successful among them lived in considerable luxury and wielded real influence. But they were also looked down upon, their profession considered degrading despite the high level of art and cultivation it required. A truly skilled geisha was not just beautiful, but also accomplished in the arts. She could play the shamisen or koto beautifully. She could dance with exquisite grace. She could compose poetry on the spot, witty and clever. She could hold her own in conversation with the most educated men, discussing poetry, current events, philosophy. She was, in many ways, the ideal of feminine accomplishment, but because she sold these accomplishments rather than simply possessing them as private graces, she was stigmatized. The training required to become a geisha was long and demanding. Young girls would be apprenticed to older geisha, learning through observation and practice all the arts and social skills they would need. They would practice dance steps for hours every day, until every movement was perfect. They would practice playing musical instruments until their fingers bled. They would study poetry and calligraphy, learn to arrange flowers and prepare tea, master the complex rules of etiquette that governed social interaction in the entertainment quarters. But there was also a mysterious side to the geisha world. Some geisha were said to have supernatural beauty, to be kitsune in human form. There were stories of geisha who had strange powers, who could read men's thoughts, who could predict the future, who seemed never to age. Whether these stories had any truth to them, or whether they were simply the result of the mystery and fascination that surrounded these women, they added to the sense that the geisha districts were places where ordinary rules did not quite apply. The relationship between life and death in Kyoto was not one of simple opposition. Death was understood as a transition rather than an ending, and the dead were believed to remain connected to the living in important ways. Ancestors were venerated at family altars, receiving daily offerings of food and incense. On certain days throughout the year, special ceremonies were performed to honor the dead and ensure their continued well-being in the afterlife. The most important of these observances was the Obon festival, when the spirits of the dead were believed to return to visit their families. Preparation for Obon began days in advance. with thorough cleaning of houses and graves, with the preparation of special foods that the deceased had enjoyed in life. When the festival arrived, lanterns were lit to guide the spirits home, and people would gather to dance and celebrate, honouring the dead while also affirming the ongoing life of the community. At the end of the Obon period, lanterns were set adrift on rivers or released into the sky, lighting the way for the spirits to return to their proper realm. It was a poignant moment, this farewell, and people would watch the floating lights drift away with a mixture of sadness and peace, knowing that they had honoured their dead and that you would meet again next year. But not all spirits were benevolent ancestors. There were also troubled spirits, ghosts who had died with unfinished business or unresolved emotions, who wandered the earth unable to find peace. These spirits could be harmful, causing illness or accidents to the living. They required special rituals to appease them, to help them resolve whatever was binding them to the earthly realm, so that they could move on to their next existence. Buddhist temples offered services to help troubled spirits. Monks would perform ceremonies involving the chanting of sutras, the offering of incense and flowers, prayers for the liberation of all beings from suffering. These ceremonies were understood to generate merit that could be transferred to the spirits, helping them to overcome the karmic obstacles that kept them trapped and suffering. There were also specialists called Miko, female shamans who could serve as mediums between the living and the dead. These women would go into trances and allow spirits to speak through them, giving messages to living family members, revealing information about the circumstances of their death, sometimes simply expressing emotions that they had been unable to express in life. These sessions could be deeply emotional, providing closure for the living and release for the dead. The architecture of Kyoto was designed to facilitate harmony with the natural world and the spiritual realm. Buildings were constructed using principles that took into account the flow of cosmic energies, the relationship between structure and landscape, the importance of creating spaces that felt balanced and peaceful. The houses of the nobles were elegant structures of wood and paper, with rooms that could be reconfigured by moving sliding screens, with gardens visible from every room, with an aesthetic of natural materials and refined simplicity. These houses were not meant to dominate their surroundings, but to nestle into them, to create a seamless transition between inside and outside, between the human-made and the natural. The use of natural materials was not just practical, but also spiritual. Wood was a living substance, retaining something of the tree from which it came. The grain of the wood, left visible and unpainted, was appreciated for its unique beauty. The posts and beams of a house were often massive timbers selected for their particular qualities, and they were treated with respect, understood as holding within them the spirit of the forest. The gardens that surrounded these houses were not separate from them but integral parts of the whole design. The garden could be viewed from the house, but it could also be entered and experienced directly. Stepping stones led through carefully composed scenes. Small bridges crossed streams, lanterns marked pathways and provided both practical illumination and aesthetic focal points. Every element was placed with intention, creating a landscape that appeared natural, but was actually the result of meticulous planning and ongoing maintenance. The tea houses where the tea ceremony was performed were perhaps the most refined expression of Kyoto's architectural aesthetic. These were small, simple structures, often tucked away in quiet corners of gardens, accessible only by narrow paths that required visitors to slow down and become mindful of their surroundings. The entrance to a tea house was deliberately low, requiring even the highest-ranking samurai to bow as they entered, symbolizing the equality of all participants in the ceremony. Inside, the tea house was a world apart. The room was small, just large enough for a handful of people to sit comfortably. The walls were plain, the floor covered in tatami mats. The only decorations were a hanging scroll in the alcove and perhaps a single flower in a simple vase. The light that entered through paper screens was soft and diffused, creating an atmosphere of tranquility and focus. In this simple space, the tea ceremony unfolded according to precise choreography that had been refined over generations. Every movement had meaning, from the way the host handled the implements to the way guests received and drank the tea. The ceremony was not about the tea itself, though that was important. It was about creating a perfect moment, a space of harmony and peace where the participants could connect with one another and with something beyond themselves. The temples of Kyoto were architectural marvels, massive wooden structures built without the use of nails, their enormous pillars and beams fitted together with such precision that they had stood for centuries. The largest temple halls were vast spaces that could hold hundreds of people, with high ceilings supported by forests of pillars, with floors that glowed in the light of oil lamps and candles. The pagodas that rose above these temple complexes were engineering feats as well as spiritual symbols. These multi-tiered towers were designed to flex and sway during earthquakes, dispersing the energy of the shaking rather than resisting it rigidly. At the center of each pagoda was a massive wooden pillar that ran from the foundation to the top, not actually supporting the structure, but serving as a spiritual axis, a connection between earth and heaven. The bells housed in temple bell towers were themselves objects of great craftsmanship and spiritual significance. The largest of these bells weighed several tons and required teams of people to ring them. The sound they produced was deep and resonant, carrying for miles, marking the hours and calling the faithful to prayer. These bells were decorated with Buddhist imagery and inscriptions, and their casting was accompanied by elaborate rituals and prayers. The decoration of temples combined richness with restraint. Gold leaf might cover entire surfaces, creating an impression of overwhelming splendor. Paintings of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas filled the walls and ceilings. Carved wooden sculptures depicted protective deities and celestial beings. But all of this visual richness was contained within architectural frameworks of austere simplicity, creating a balance between the mundane and the transcendent. The festivals of Kyoto brought the city to life in spectacular ways, temporarily transforming the ordinary rhythms of daily existence. Some festivals were quiet and contemplative, like the moon-viewing gatherings of autumn. Others were raucous and energetic, like the Gion Festival, with its enormous floats and crowds of celebrants. Each neighborhood in Kyoto had its own local festivals, times when the entire community would come together to honor the local kami, to celebrate the season, to affirm their shared identity. These festivals often involved processions carrying portable shrines through the streets, with the shrine swaying and bouncing as it was carried, the bearers chanting rhythmic calls, musicians playing traditional instruments, children running alongside with excitement. The preparation for major festivals took months. The great floats of the Gion Festival were stored in special buildings throughout the year, carefully maintained and repaired as needed. Each neighborhood was responsible for one float, and the community would work together to prepare it, cleaning and decorating it, practicing the music and dances that would be performed, making the costumes and preparing the special foods that would be shared. When the day of the festival finally arrived, it was as if the entire city exhaled, releasing all the accumulated energy and anticipation in a burst of color and sound and movement. The streets would be filled with people in their festival best, with vendors selling special foods and trinkets, with performers entertaining the crowds. There would be a sense of possibility in the air, a feeling that on this special day, anything might happen. And indeed, festivals were times when supernatural encounters seemed more likely. The boundaries between worlds felt thinner during these liminal times. People reported seeing figures in old-fashioned dress moving through the crowds, figures who would disappear when approached. Music would be heard coming from unexpected directions. Strange lights would appear in the sky. These experiences were accepted as part of the festival atmosphere, signs that the spirits were joining in the celebration. The darker side of Kyoto's spiritual life involved practices that most people would rather not acknowledge, but that nonetheless existed. There were practitioners of curses and black magic, people who claimed to be able to harm enemies or compel the affections of reluctant lovers through supernatural means. These practices were officially condemned but secretly consulted by people desperate enough to seek such solutions to their problems. The creation of a curse doll, a straw figure that represented the intended victim, was one such practice. The doll would be prepared with elaborate rituals, sometimes including obtaining something that had belonged to the victim, hair or nail clippings or a piece of clothing. Then nails would be driven into the doll while cursing the victim, each nail a wish for suffering or death. The doll would be hidden in a secret place, or buried at a crossroads, and the curse would be believed to work slowly, bringing illness or misfortune to the target. Another dark practice involved visiting certain places at specific times to perform rituals meant to summon malevolent spirits or to make pacts with demonic entities. These places were usually associated with death or suffering, execution grounds or battlefields, places where the boundary between worlds was thin and dangerous entities could more easily cross over. But while these dark practices existed, they were generally feared and avoided by most people. The spiritual practitioners most people consulted were those who worked to protect and heal rather than harm, who used their knowledge and power to ward off evil rather than to create it. The protective talismans created by priests and onmyoji were common sights in Kyoto. These were slips of paper or wood, inscribed with sacred characters and blessed through ritual, believed to protect the bearer from illness, accidents, evil spirits, and other misfortunes. People would carry these talismans on their person, place them in their houses, attach them to their belongings. Different talismans were created for different purposes. There were talismans for safe childbirth, for success in business, for protection while traveling, for warding off specific diseases. There were talismans to protect houses from fire, to ensure good harvests, to maintain harmony within families. The creation of these talismans involved knowledge of sacred texts and symbols, understanding of timing and astrological influences, and the performance of rituals that charged the talisman with protective power. The role of education in Kyoto was to transmit not just practical knowledge, but also cultural values and spiritual understanding. Children of noble families received thorough education in Chinese classics, in poetry and calligraphy, in music and dance, in the complex rules of etiquette that governed every aspect of social interaction. But they also learned about the unseen world, about the spirits and gods, about proper behavior towards supernatural beings, about the rituals and observances that maintained harmony between the human and divine realms. Stories were an important part of this education. Children heard tales of virtuous people rewarded by the gods, of wicked people punished, of supernatural encounters that taught moral lessons. These stories entertained, but they also instructed, providing models of proper behavior and warnings about the consequences of improper conduct. The education of girls focused more on the arts and on social skills and on the Chinese classics that boys studied. Girls learned calligraphy and poetry, music and dance, flower arrangement and incense appreciation. They learned how to dress appropriately for different occasions, how to move with grace, how to speak with proper modesty and indirection, and they learned the stories and beliefs that they would pass on to their own children, maintaining the transmission of culture across generations. The relationship between Kyoto and the surrounding countryside was complex and interdependent. The city depended on the countryside for food and other resources, while the countryside looked to the city as the centre of culture, religion, and political authority. People moved between the two realms, farmers coming to the city to sell their produce, nobles visiting their country estates, monks travelling between urban temples and rural hermitages. The countryside was seen as more wild and primitive than the city, a place where nature was less constrained, and where supernatural forces were stronger and less predictable. The deep mountains and dark forests were understood to be the dwelling places of powerful spirits, realms where humans ventured at their peril. The rivers and valleys were home to various beings, some helpful, some harmful, all demanding respect and proper treatment. But the countryside also had its own beauty and its own spirituality. The small shrines that dotted the rural landscape were places of simple devotion, where local people made offerings to the spirits that protected their fields and villages. The natural features of the landscape, unusual rock formations or ancient trees or sacred springs, were venerated as dwelling places of kami, and people would make pilgrimages to these sites to pray for specific blessings. The contrast between urban sophistication and rural simplicity was not seen as absolute. The nobles of Kyoto appreciated the aesthetic of rustic simplicity, finding beauty in rough pottery and thatched roofs, in the unsophisticated directness of country people. This appreciation was embodied in the concept of wabi-sabi, the aesthetic of imperfection and transience, of things that were simple and unadorned but possessed a quiet beauty born of authenticity and age. The sounds of Kyoto created an acoustic landscape as distinctive as its physical form. The city had its rhythms and its signature sounds that marked the passage of time and the changing of seasons, the temple bells that rang at regular intervals throughout the day and night, the calls of street vendors advertising their wares, the clip-clop of wooden Gita sandals on stone streets, the rustling of silk robes, the splash of water being poured for purification, the crack of wooden clappers announcing a performance or ceremony. At night the soundscape changed. The daytime bustle faded away, replaced by quieter sounds, the hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, the distant sound of someone playing the shakuhachi flute, the creaking of wooden buildings as they settled, and sometimes sounds that had no clear source, that might have been the wind or might have been something else entirely. The seasonal sounds were part of what made each time of year distinctive. In spring, the nightingale's song was eagerly awaited, a sign that winter had truly passed. In summer, the constant buzzing of cicadas created a wall of sound that was almost overwhelming. In autumn, the call of migrating geese flying overhead reminded people of the passage of time. In winter, the absence of sound, the muffled quiet of snow-covered streets, created its own particular atmosphere. Music in Kyoto was understood not just as entertainment, but as a means of expressing and inducing emotional and spiritual states. The different instruments had their own associations and appropriate uses. The koto, with its long, graceful form and 13 strings, was associated with elegance and refinement. The biwa, with its pear-shaped body and 4 strings, was the instrument of wandering storytellers who used it to accompany epic tales. The shakuhachi flute, with its breathy, melancholy tone, was favoured by Zen monks as a meditation practice. To master a musical instrument required years of dedicated practice. The fingering patterns had to become second nature, the production of tone had to be perfected, the repertoire of traditional pieces had to be learned and internalized. But technical mastery was not the ultimate goal. The goal was to reach a state where the music flowed naturally, where there was no separation between player and instrument, where the music became a direct expression of the player's inner state. The visual artists of Kyoto worked in multiple media, each with its own techniques and traditions. Painters worked with ink and watercolors on silk or paper, creating images that range from bold and dramatic to subtle and suggestive. Sculptors carved statues of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas from wood or cast them in bronze, following strict iconographic rules while also seeking to imbue their work with spiritual presence. Calligraphers were perhaps the most revered of all artists, because calligraphy was seen as the most direct expression of the artist's character and spiritual cultivation. The way someone wielded the brush, the rhythm and flow of their strokes, the balance and composition of the finished piece, all of these revealed something essential about the calligrapher. A piece of calligraphy by a great master was treasured not just for its technical excellence, but for what it revealed about the person who created it. The materials used in these arts were themselves important. The paper was handmade, its texture and absorbency affecting how the ink would behave. The ink was ground fresh for each session, mixed with water to the proper consistency. The brushes were made from various materials, different types of hair creating different qualities of line. All of these materials had to be understood and mastered, their properties respected and worked with rather than against. The concept of ma, the space between things, was fundamental to Japanese aesthetics as practiced in Kyoto. In music, it was the silence between notes that gave the notes their meaning. In painting, it was the empty space that made the painted forms visible. In architecture, it was the empty rooms and open spaces that made the structure livable. In conversation, it was the pauses and what was left unsaid that often carried the deepest meaning. This appreciation of emptiness and absence was connected to Buddhist teachings about emptiness as the fundamental nature of reality. But it was also simply an aesthetic sensibility, a recognition that too much of anything, even good things, became oppressive. The empty spaces created room for contemplation, for imagination, for the free play of mind and spirit. The preservation of traditional knowledge and practices was a constant concern in Kyoto. As the city evolved and changed, there was always the risk that valuable traditions might be lost, that the accumulated wisdom of centuries might be forgotten. This concern led to careful transmission of knowledge from masters to students, to the writing down of oral traditions, to the maintenance of institutions that could preserve and protect important practices. The system of apprenticeship in the crafts ensured that technical knowledge was passed down intact. A young person who wanted to learn a craft would enter the household of a master, living and working there for years, learning through observation and practice rather than through explicit instruction. This system created strong bonds between master and apprentice, and ensured that subtle aspects of the craft that could not be put into words were nonetheless transmitted. Religious knowledge was preserved through different mechanisms. Buddhist texts were copied by hand generation after generation, ensuring that the teachings were not lost even if individual copies were destroyed. Ritual practices were performed over and over, their exact forms preserved through tradition and training. Oral teachings were passed from master to student in unbroken lineages stretching back through time, But there was also recognition that some things could not be preserved indefinitely, that change was inevitable and even necessary. The cherry blossoms bloomed and fell. Generations were born and died. Traditions evolved and sometimes disappeared. This was understood as the natural order of things, part of the fundamental impermanence that characterized all existence. The practice of pilgrimage connected Kyoto to the larger spiritual geography of Japan. Pilgrims would travel from Kyoto to sacred sites throughout the country, sometimes spending months or even years on the road. These journeys were undertaken for various reasons: to fulfill vows, to seek healing, to accumulate merit, to experience spiritual transformation. The pilgrimage routes themselves became sacred, marked by shrines and temples where pilgrims could rest and make offerings. The physical journey was understood as paralleling an inner spiritual journey, with the challenges and difficulties of travel serving as opportunities for growth and purification. Pilgrims would return to Kyoto changed by their experiences, bringing back stories and insights that enriched the spiritual life of the city. But one did not have to leave Kyoto to experience pilgrimage. The city itself contained countless sacred sites, and there were pilgrimage routes that connected multiple temples or shrines within the city. Walking these routes, visiting each site in turn, making offerings and prayers, was itself a form of spiritual practice, a way of engaging deeply with the sacred landscape of the city. The understanding of time in Kyoto was multi-layered and complex. There was the practical time of daily life, measured by the sun and marked by temple bells. There was the cyclical time of the seasons and agricultural calendar, endlessly repeating but never exactly the same. There was the linear time of history, the succession of emperors and dynasties, the record of events that had shaped the city and nation. And there was sacred time, the time of ritual and myth, when the present moment opened onto eternity. These different concepts of time coexisted and interpenetrated. A seasonal festival was simultaneously a practical marker of the agricultural year, a historical tradition connecting present to past, and a sacred ritual that brought participants into contact with timeless truths. To live in Kyoto was to inhabit all of these temporalities at once, to be aware that the moment was both fleeting and eternal, both historically specific and timelessly archetypal. The moon, as it moved through its phases, provided another way of marking time. The lunar calendar determined the dates of festivals and the auspiciousness of particular days. The full moon was a time of power and beauty, while the new moon was a time of darkness and potential danger. The waxing and waning of the moon paralleled countless other cycles: the ebb and flow of tides, the rise and fall of dynasties, the growth and decay of all things. The celestial realm was understood to be connected to the earthly realm in complex ways. The movements of planets and stars influenced events on Earth, and skilled onmyoji could read these celestial signs to predict the future and determine auspicious times for important activities. Comets and eclipses were seen as particularly significant omens, portents of great changes or disasters to come. The concept of fate was understood in Kyoto through the lens of Buddhist karma. One's current circumstances were the result of actions in past lives, and one's current actions would shape future circumstances. But this was not a deterministic worldview. Choices mattered. Actions had consequences. Through wisdom and compassion, through ethical behavior and spiritual practice, one could improve one's karmic situation over time. This understanding provided a framework for making sense of suffering and inequality. Why was one person born into wealth while another was born into poverty? Karma provided an explanation, but it also emphasized personal responsibility. Whatever one's current situation, one could choose to act skillfully or unskillfully, to create positive or negative karma, to move toward liberation or deeper entanglement in suffering. The natural world was understood in Kyoto not as something separate from or opposed to human culture, but as fundamentally interconnected with it. The gardens that seemed so natural were actually careful human creations. The poems about nature were really poems about human emotions and experiences. The seasonal observations were simultaneously aesthetic appreciation and spiritual practice. This sense of continuity between nature and culture, between the human and non-human, was part of what made possible the rich supernatural beliefs of Kyoto. If the natural world and the human world were not fundamentally separate, then it made perfect sense that spirits could inhabit both, that the boundary between them would be permeable, that influence could flow in both directions. The animals of Kyoto participated in this interconnected world. The deer that roamed freely in certain sacred precincts were understood to be messengers of the gods. The crows that gathered in large flocks were sometimes seen as omens. The snakes that appeared in gardens might be manifestations of dragon spirits. Even insects were understood to have spiritual significance. The butterflies that fluttered among the flowers, perhaps being the souls of the dead returning for a brief visit. The practice of compassion toward animals was encouraged by Buddhist teachings. All beings, according to Buddhism, had been one's mother in some past life, and all possessed the potential for enlightenment. To harm animals unnecessarily was to create negative karma. Many people chose to be vegetarian, refusing to eat meat out of compassion for the animals that would have to be killed. But there were also animals that were feared. Wild boars from the mountains could be dangerous if encountered on lonely paths. Poisonous snakes posed a real threat. And then there were the supernatural animals, the kitsune who could transform into beautiful women, the tanuki who loved to play tricks, the kappa who lurked in rivers and ponds waiting to drown the unwary. As the centuries passed and Kyoto endured through war and peace, prosperity and hardship, natural disaster and human-made catastrophe, the mysterious dimension of life in the city persisted. The ghosts of new tragedies joined the existing population of spirits. The stories were updated but retained their essential form. The rituals evolved but maintained their core purpose of connecting the human and divine realms. Through all these changes, Kyoto remained a place where mystery was not an aberration, but an essential aspect of existence. The nobles who walked its palace corridors, the monks who meditated in its temples, the merchants who sold their wares in its markets, the artisans who perfected their crafts in its workshops, all of them lived with an awareness that the world was larger and stranger than ordinary perception revealed. They knew that the beautiful lady passing in her palanquin might be a fox spirit in disguise. They knew that the old beggar on the street corner might be a god testing their compassion. They knew that the garden they walked through each day might on certain nights become a portal to other realms. They knew that their ancestors watched over them, that spirits dwelt in ancient trees and sacred stones, that the boundary between the visible and invisible was thin as paper and just as easily torn. This awareness shaped how they lived. It made them attentive to signs and omens. It made them respectful of places and beings they could not see. It made them careful about their actions, knowing that karma was real and that consequences extended beyond this single life. It made them appreciative of beauty, knowing that all beautiful things were temporary and that to see beauty fully required accepting its transience. The mysterious side of life in Imperial Kyoto was not separate from daily life, but woven through it like gold thread through silk. It was there in the morning offerings made at household altars, in the way people bowed when passing shrines, in the festivals that mark the turning year, in the stories told to children as they drifted off to sleep, in the poems written about the moon and cherry blossoms and autumn leaves. It was there in the temples where incense smoke rose toward ancient rafters, in the gardens where moss grew thick and green, in the palace halls where emperors had walked, in the quiet streets at night when lanterns cast pools of golden light and shadows moved in ways that could not quite be explained. It was there in the sound of temple bells echoing through the valley, in the rustling of bamboo in the wind, in the splash of water over stones in a garden stream. The people of Kyoto lived beautiful lives filled with art and poetry, ritual and refinement, but they also lived mysterious lives, aware always that they moved through a world that extended far beyond what they could see or touch, a world populated by spirits and gods, by the dead who had not truly departed and the forces that shaped destiny. They accepted this mystery not with fear, but with grace, understanding that the unknown was not something to be conquered or eliminated, but something to be respected and honoured. And so the city continued, generation after generation, its streets walked by countless feet, its gardens tended by countless hands, its temples filled with countless prayers. The cherry blossoms bloomed and fell, the moon waxed and waned, the seasons turned their eternal wheel, and through it all the mysterious dimension persisted, patient and eternal, waiting for those who had eyes to see and hearts to understand. The lanterns glowed in the darkness, their soft light pushing back the night but never quite dispelling it, for the darkness too had its place and purpose. The incense rose from 1,000 altars, carrying prayers and wishes up toward whatever realm the gods and Buddhas inhabited. The bells rang out their measured rhythm, marking time but also transcending it, their sound connecting past and present and future in a single resonant note. In the quiet gardens behind temple walls, where the moss grew thick and the stones had been placed just so, where the sound of water flowing over rocks created a gentle music, the mystery of existence revealed itself to those patient enough to simply sit and be present. In the dim halls where Buddha statues gazed out with eyes of infinite compassion, where the air was thick with centuries of prayer and devotion, the boundary between the earthly and the divine grew thin enough to step through. This was the mysterious side of a life in Imperial Kyoto, this awareness that every moment held within it the possibility of wonder, that every shadow might hide a spirit, that every beautiful thing was also a teaching about impermanence and letting go, that the world was always more than it appeared to be, always richer and stranger and more filled with grace than the busy mind could fully comprehend. The nobles in their silk robes understood this. The monks in their meditation knew this. The merchants in their shops felt this. The artisans at their work embodied this. The children playing in the streets sensed this. The elderly sitting on their verandas remembered this. And the city itself, ancient and beautiful, mysterious and serene, held all of these knowing and not knowing together in a unity that was itself a kind of answer to the great questions that humans have always asked about the meaning of existence and the nature of reality. The mist rose from the ponds at dawn, carrying with it the secret knowledge of the night. The light fell through the maple leaves in autumn, painting the ground with shadows that danced like spirits. The snow covered everything in winter with a blanket of silence and purity. The cherry blossoms filled the air in spring with a fragrance that seemed to come from some other, better world. The fireflies blinked their messages in summer darkness, speaking in a language older than words, and always Underlying everything, supporting everything, flowing through everything was the mystery, vast and deep and ultimately unknowable, the mystery that made life something more than just biological process, that made beauty something more than just pleasing arrangements of form and colour, that made love and loss and longing all part of something larger and more meaningful than individual experience. The people of Kyoto did not solve this mystery. They did not conquer it or explain it away. Instead, they honoured it. They celebrated it. They made room for it in their lives and in their city. They built their temples and shrines, performed their rituals and ceremonies, told their stories and wrote their poems, all as ways of engaging with and acknowledging the mysterious dimension that made existence profound rather than trivial, sacred rather than merely mundane. And in doing so, they created a culture of exquisite beauty and refinement, a way of life that recognized that the most important truths could not be stated directly, but only approached through art and ritual and story, through the changing seasons and the phases of the moon, through the practice of mindfulness and the cultivation of aesthetic sensitivity, through the simple act of paying attention to the world with an open heart and a quiet mind. The mysterious side of life in Imperial Kyoto was not something separate from the city's visible beauty and cultural sophistication. It was the foundation on which that beauty and culture rested, the soil in which they grew. Without the awareness of mystery, the poetry would have been mere wordplay, the gardens only arrangements of rocks and plants, the rituals empty gestures. But with that awareness, everything took on depth and resonance. Everything became part of a larger story about the relationship between the human and divine, the visible and invisible, the temporal and eternal. This was the gift that Kyoto offered to those who lived within its walls and to all who came after, this understanding that life could be lived with grace and beauty, with awareness and reverence, with an openness to mystery that did not require answers or explanations but only presence and attention. This was the wisdom that had been accumulated over centuries of lived experience, distilled into rituals and stories, embodied in arts and practices, passed down from generation to generation as a precious inheritance. And even now, centuries later, something of that wisdom remains, something of that mysterious quality that made Kyoto more than just a city, that made it a threshold between worlds, a place where the veil was thin and truth occasionally showed its face. The temples still stand, the gardens still receive visitors, the stories are still told, and sometimes, if you're very quiet and very attentive, if you approach with respect and an open heart, you might catch a glimpse of what the people of old Kyoto knew and felt, that sense of living in a world shot through with mystery and meaning, where every moment was precious and every experience was an opportunity for awakening to the profound truth that underlies all existence. The legends of Kyoto were countless, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of the city's mysterious heritage. There was the story of the Rashomon Gate, that great southern entrance to the ancient capital, which had once been the haunt of demons and oni. In the days when the gate still stood, people would avoid passing beneath it after dark, for it was said that terrible creatures lurked in its upper stories, creatures with horns and wild hair and appetites for human flesh. One famous tale told of a samurai named Watanabe no Tsuna, who'd been challenged by his companions to prove his courage by venturing to the Rashomon Gate at the hour of the ox. He had accepted the challenge, riding his horse through the dark streets to the gate. As he passed beneath it, something had seized his helmet, trying to pull him up into the darkness above. Tsuna had drawn his sword and struck at whatever held him, severing an arm that fell to the ground. When he examined it by torchlight, he he found it was covered in coarse black hair and ended in terrible claws. He had carried this trophy home, keeping it locked away as proof of his encounter. But the story did not end there. Some nights later, an old woman had come to Suna's house, claiming to be his aunt come to visit. She had asked to see the demon's arm, and when Suna showed it to her, she had seized it and transformed, revealing herself to be the demon in disguise, come to reclaim what had been taken. She had fled into the night with her severed arm, and Suna never saw her again, though he remained more cautious about mysterious visitors for the rest of his days. This story was told and retold, embellished and varied, but its essential elements remained constant. It spoke to the dangers that lurked in the city after dark, to the importance of courage and quick thinking, to the ability of supernatural beings to take on deceptive forms. Children hearing this tale would feel a delicious shiver of fear, would lie awake imagining demons in the shadows of their rooms, would perhaps decide to stay a little closer to their parents when night fell. There were gentler legends too, stories that spoke to the city's beauty rather than its dangers. One such tale concerned a place called the Pond of Divine Spring, which was said to have miraculous healing properties. The story went that long ago, a young woman had been afflicted with a terrible skin disease that no physician could cure. In her desperation, she had prayed at a nearby shrine, and in a dream the god had told her to bathe in a certain pond at dawn for 100 days. She had followed these instructions faithfully, rising before the sun each day to immerse herself in the cold water. At first, nothing seemed to change, but she persevered, trusting in the god's guidance. On the 100th day, as she emerged from the water, she found that her skin had become perfectly smooth and clear, more beautiful than it had ever been. Word of this miracle spread, and ever after, people with various ailments would come to bathe in the pond, hoping for similar healing. The pond still existed in Kyoto, a quiet place surrounded by trees, its water clear and cold. People still came to make offerings at the small shrine beside it, still believed in its power to heal and purify. Whether the original story was literally true, or whether it was a poetic way of expressing the healing power of faith and perseverance, the pond remained a place where people felt a connection to something larger than themselves, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural seemed particularly permeable. Another beloved legend concerned the origin of the Kiyomizu Temple, one of Kyoto's most famous and spectacular sights. The story told of a monk named Enchin, who had been travelling through the mountains when he had a vision. In this vision, the goddess Kannon appeared to him and told him that she wished to establish a temple at a certain spring with pure water. Enchin searched the mountains until he found the spring, recognizing it by the crystalline clarity of its water and the sense of peace that pervaded the place. At the spring he met another monk, an ancient hermit who'd been living there for years, practicing austerities and cultivating wisdom. This hermit gave Enchin a piece of sacred wood and instructed him to carve an image of Kannon from it. Then the hermit vanished, and Enchin realized that he had been in the presence of a manifestation of the goddess herself, appearing in human form to guide him. Enchin carved the statue as instructed and built a small hall to house it. Over time, more monks joined him, more buildings were constructed, and the temple grew into the magnificent complex that stood on the mountainside, with its famous wooden stage jutting out over the valley, supported by massive pillars but not a single nail. Pilgrims would stand on this stage and look out over Kyoto spread below, feeling themselves suspended between earth and sky, between the ordinary world and the realm of the sacred. The Kiyomizu Temple became famous not just for its spectacular architecture and its connection to canon, but also for the 3 streams of water that fell from the spring that had first drawn Enchin to the site. These 3 streams were said to grant different blessings, one for longevity, one for success in studies, one for success in love. Pilgrims would use long-handled ladles to catch water from the streams, drinking it while making their prayers, careful to drink from only one stream, for it was said that to try to claim all 3 blessings would result in none being granted. The temple grounds were also home to the Jishu Shrine, dedicated to the god of love and matchmaking. Here, 2 stones stood several meters apart, and it was said that if someone could walk from one stone to the other with their eyes closed, they would find success in love. Young people would attempt this test, sometimes guided by friends who would call out directions, sometimes stumbling blindly on their own. The shrine was always busy with visitors seeking love, leaving offerings, purchasing amulets, writing their wishes on wooden plaques that were hung in rows until they completely covered the shrine's walls. The changing light through the day and seasons made the Kiyomizu Temple a different place at different times. In spring, when the cherry trees that surrounded it burst into bloom, the temple seemed to float on a sea of pink and white blossoms. In summer, the greenery was lush and vibrant, providing cool shade for pilgrims climbing the approach to the temple. In autumn, the maple trees turned brilliant red, creating scenes of such stunning beauty that people would travel for days just to see them. In winter, snow would blanket everything, turning the temple and its surroundings into a landscape that seemed to belong to some fairy tale realm. But the temple was perhaps most mysterious at night, when it was closed to ordinary visitors and the monks went about their rituals in privacy. Sometimes people walking in the city below would look up and see lights moving on the temple stage, would hear the sound of chanting or bells carried on the wind, would feel a sense of connection to practices that had been performed in that place for over 1,000 years. The Fushimi Inari Shrine, with its thousands of vermilion torii gates, had its own rich collection of stories and mysteries. The shrine was dedicated to Inari, the god of rice and prosperity, and it had been patronized for centuries by merchants and business people seeking success in their ventures. The thousands of torii gates that formed tunnels up the mountainside had been donated by individuals and companies who had experienced success and wanted to show gratitude to the god. To walk through these tunnels of gates was to have an experience that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. The repeated pattern of the vermilion gates created a rhythmic pulsing effect, the path winding up and up through the forest, with small shrines and fox statue appearing at intervals. The higher one climbed, the older and more weathered the gates became, until at the very top of the mountain, one found gates that dated back centuries, their wood darkened and their paint faded, but their presence somehow all the more powerful for their age. The foxes associated with Inari were understood to be magical beings, messengers or servants of the god, capable of taking human form and possessing various supernatural powers. The fox statues that guarded the shrine wore red bibs left by worshippers, and they held symbolic objects in their mouths, keys to the rice granary, representing prosperity and abundance. But there were stories about real foxes at the shrine too, foxes that would appear at dusk or dawn, moving through the gates with an eeriness that suggested they were more than ordinary animals. Some people reported following such a fox deeper and deeper into the mountain, losing track of time and direction, until the fox vanished and they found themselves in parts of the shrine they had never seen before, parts that seemed somehow older and stranger than the rest. There was a famous story about a merchant who'd been visiting the shrine to ask for success in a new business venture. As he was leaving, a beautiful woman had approached him, asking if she could walk with him back down the mountain. He had agreed, charmed by her beauty and grace. They had walked together, talking easily, and he had felt a strong attraction to her. But as they emerged from the Torii Gate tunnels into the ordinary streets of Kyoto, he had glanced at a shop window and seen their reflections. The woman walking beside him was reflected not as a human, but as a fox walking on its hind legs. Startled, he had turned to look at her directly, and she had smiled sadly, knowing that he had seen her true form. She had told him that she'd been helping guide him because she had seen that he had a good heart, that his business would prosper, but that now that he knew what she was, she could no longer accompany him. Then she had walked away, and when he tried to follow, she had turned a corner and vanished. His business did prosper, exactly as she had implied it would, and he never forgot his encounter with the fox spirit, though he never told anyone about it until he was an old man, fearing that people would think him mad. The Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, was another of Kyoto's most iconic structures, a building so beautiful that it seemed to belong to some other perfect world. The pavilion was covered in gold leaf, its 3 stories rising above a pond in which it was perfectly reflected. The building had been originally constructed as a retirement villa for a shogun who wished to surround himself with beauty in his final years. After his death, it had been converted into a Zen temple. The Golden Pavilion was designed to embody different aesthetic principles on each of its 3 floors. The first floor was built in the style of a palace, with its heavy posts and its open views of the garden. The second floor was built in the style of a samurai house, with more enclosed spaces suitable for contemplation. The third floor was built in the Zen temple style, a space for meditation and spiritual practice, topped with a golden phoenix that seemed ready to take flight. The pond in front of the pavilion contained islands representing the Buddhist conception of paradise, and the garden was designed to be viewed from multiple angles as one walked the path around the pond, each view carefully composed to create a perfect scene. The reflection of the golden building in the still water was particularly admired, for it created a sense of doubling and mystery, as if there were 2 golden pavilions, one in the earthly realm and one in some watery otherworld. The building had a tragic history. In the mid-20th century it had been burned down by a disturbed young monk who had become obsessed with its beauty, and who claimed that he destroyed it because he could not bear the thought that such perfection existed in an imperfect world. The current building was a careful reconstruction, and some people said that the new structure, for all its technical perfection, lacked something of the presence of the original. Others maintained that the building's spirit had survived, and that the Golden Pavilion remained a place of profound beauty and peace. There was a strange story associated with the burning of the Golden Pavilion, a story that some people whispered even though it seemed too odd to be true. They said that on the night before the fire, several people in different parts of Kyoto had dreamed of the phoenix on the pavilion's roof taking flight, circling the city 3 times, and then flying away toward the east. When they woke and heard about the fire, they wondered if the phoenix, which represented the building spirit, had known what was coming and had departed before the destruction. The Ryanji Temple was famous throughout the world for its rock garden, a rectangular space filled with white gravel and 15 rocks arranged in 5 groups. This was perhaps the most austere and minimal of all Japanese gardens, containing nothing but rocks and gravel, yet it was also one of the most profound, inviting contemplation and interpretation. The rocks were arranged so that from any viewpoint within the garden, at least one rock was always hidden from sight. This was understood as a metaphor for the incompleteness of worldly perception, the recognition that we can never see the whole truth, that something always remains beyond our grasp. Different viewers saw different things in the arrangement of the rocks. Some saw islands in an ocean. Some saw mountain peaks rising above clouds. Some saw a mother tiger crossing a river with her cubs. Some saw nothing representational at all, only balance and space, and the play of form against emptiness. The garden was meant to be viewed from the veranda of the abbot's quarters, sitting in meditation posture, letting the mind settle until thoughts ceased and there was only direct seeing. Zen masters said that the garden was a meditation aid, that its very simplicity prevented the mind from grasping at concepts and stories, allowing it to rest in pure awareness. But even this austere garden had its mysteries. There were stories of monks who had meditated there and had experienced profound insights, moments of awakening that changed their entire understanding of reality. There were accounts of visitors who had sat before the garden and had suddenly felt all their worries and anxieties fall away, leaving them in a state of perfect peace. And there were those who claimed that if you meditated in the garden at the right time, in the right state of mind, the rocks would seem to shift and change, revealing patterns and meanings that were not visible to ordinary perception. The Sanju Sanjendo temple housed 1,001 statues of Kannon, the Bodhisattva of compassion, all arranged in rows within a hall that stretched over 100 meters long. To enter this hall was to be confronted with an overwhelming vision of compassion multiplied, with 1,000 faces of the Bodhisattva gazing out, no two exactly alike, each one carved with exquisite detail and care. The main statue, larger than the others and covered in gold leaf, sat in the centre of the hall, with 500 statues to either side. Each of the 1,000 smaller statues was life-sized, standing on individual platforms, their multiple arms holding various implements representing the different ways that compassion manifests in the world. In the flickering light of candles and oil lamps, the statues seemed almost alive, their wooden faces expressing infinite kindness and wisdom. There was a belief that if you looked carefully among the 1,000 statues, you would find one whose face resembled someone you knew, someone you had lost or someone you missed. Many people came to the temple specifically to look for such a face, walking slowly along the rows of statues, searching for a familiar feature, a particular expression. And some did find what they sought, standing before a statue and feeling a sense of recognition and connection that brought tears to their eyes. The temple also housed 28 statues of protective deities, fierce beings whose role was to defend the Dharma and protect practitioners. These statues were dramatically different from the serene canons, with their wild expressions and dynamic poses, their crowns and weapons and flaming auras. They represented the forceful aspect of compassion, the willingness to take wrathful action if necessary to protect the vulnerable and prevent harm. One of these protective deities was Fudo Myu, often depicted with a sword to cut through ignorance and a rope to bind demons and evil influences. His face was set in a fierce scowl, and one of his eyes looked upward, while the other looked downward, symbolizing his ability to see everything in heaven and earth. Despite his fearsome appearance, he was understood to be a manifestation of great compassion, using whatever means necessary to help beings achieve liberation. The Ginkakuji, the silver pavilion, was the counterpart to the golden pavilion, though it was never actually covered in silver as originally intended. Instead, it presented a more subdued aesthetic with its natural wood and its elegant proportions, its careful integration with the surrounding garden. The pavilion had been built as a retirement villa for another shogun, This one a man of great cultural refinement who had been a patron of tea ceremony, flower arrangement, incense appreciation, and all the arts that would come to define Japanese aesthetic culture. The gardens at Ginkakuji were particularly famous, especially the dry garden with its cone of white sand that was raked into perfect geometric form and that was said to represent Mount Fuji, though interpretations varied. There was also a pond garden and a moss garden, and a path that led up into the hills behind the temple, offering changing views of the buildings below and the city beyond. Walking the path around Ginkakuji, one moved through a series of carefully composed scenes, each one revealing different aspects of the garden's beauty. There were stones placed to suggest naturalness, while actually being the result of meticulous planning. There were plants chosen for their seasonal changes and their associations with classical poetry. There were water features that created soothing sounds and that reflected light in particular ways. The overall effect was one of refined simplicity, of beauty that revealed itself gradually rather than announcing itself boldly. This aesthetic, known as wabi-sabi, prized the imperfect, the incomplete, the modest, finding beauty in things that were weathered and worn, that showed the marks of age and use. It was an aesthetic deeply connected to Zen Buddhism's emphasis on seeing through surface appearances to underlying reality, on finding the extraordinary in the ordinary. The philosopher's path, which connected Ginkakuji to other temples in the area, was another place where the mysterious side of Kyoto revealed itself in subtle ways. This was a stone walkway that followed a canal lined with hundreds of cherry trees that created a tunnel of blossoms in spring. The path was named for a famous philosopher who had walked it daily, using the quiet and beauty of the walk as an aid to his thinking and meditation. To walk the philosopher's path was to move through a space that felt separate from the bustle of the modern city. The sound of water flowing in the canal, the shade of the cherry trees, the occasional small shrine or temple along the way, all created an atmosphere conducive to reflection and contemplation. People walked slowly, either alone or in quiet companionship, using the time to think about their lives, to process emotions, to simply be present with the beauty around them. But the path had its mysterious moments too. There were reports of people seeing figures in old-fashioned dress walking ahead of them, figures that would disappear when approached. There were stories of encountering other walkers who would engage in deep philosophical conversations and then vanish at the end of the path, leaving the person wondering if they had been speaking with a spirit or a manifestation of some kind. There were accounts of experiencing sudden moments of insight or clarity while walking the path, as if the place itself facilitated such experiences. The Nijo Castle, though not a temple or shrine, was another site rich in mystery and history. This had been the residence of the Tokugawa shoguns when they visited Kyoto, a magnificent complex of buildings surrounded by moats and massive stone walls. The castle's architecture was designed to be both beautiful and defensible, with elaborate decorative elements combined with practical features for protection and surveillance. One of the most famous features of Nijo Castle was the nightingale floors, wooden corridors that had been constructed to squeak when walked upon, alerting guards to the presence of any intruders. The mechanism was simple but ingenious, using metal clamps and nails arranged so that any weight on the boards would cause them to rub together, creating a chirping sound that did indeed resemble a nightingale's song. Walking these corridors, even as a visitor during the day, one could imagine the castle at night, guards listening intently for the sound of nightingale floors in parts of the castle where no one should be walking. The rooms of the castle were decorated with spectacular wall paintings by the greatest artists of the day, depicting natural scenes and symbolic animals. There were pine trees and tigers, peacocks and flowers, all rendered in gold leaf and brilliant colours. These paintings served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the wealth and power of the shogun. They created atmospheres appropriate to different types of rooms and meetings, and they sometimes incorporated subtle political messages through their symbolism. But the castle also had its darker aspects. There were secret passageways and hidden chambers where ninja guards could conceal themselves, ready to emerge if the shogun was threatened. There were rooms where important political decisions had been made, decisions that had shaped the fate of the nation. And there were stories of ghosts, of course, stories of samurai who had died in the castle's service and whose spirits still walked its corridors. One famous tale concerned a loyal retainer who'd been ordered to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, after being falsely accused of treason. He had performed the act with perfect composure, dying in the castle's garden. Ever after, his ghost was said to appear in that garden on moonlit nights, walking the same paths he had walked in life, perhaps still trying to clear his name or perhaps simply unable to leave the place where he had spent his final moments. The markets and commercial districts of Kyoto had their own character and their own mysteries. The Nishiki market, known as Kyoto's Kitchen, was a covered arcade stretching for several blocks, lined with shops selling every imaginable type of food and cooking implement. Walking through this market was an assault on the senses in the best possible way, with a smell of grilling fish and pickling vegetables, the sight of beautifully arranged produce and handmade sweets, the sound of vendors calling out their wares and customers bargaining. But the market also had its traditions and its stories. There were shops that had been run by the same families for generations, passing down not just recipes and techniques, but also knowledge of the market's rhythms and secrets. The vendors knew which customers preferred what, could remember orders from weeks or months previous, could tell stories about the history of various foods and preparations. Some of these shops specialized in ingredients used for traditional ceremonies and festivals. There were places that sold the special rice used for making mochi, the pounded rice cakes eaten at New Year. There were shops that offered the particular types of vegetables used in Buddhist temple cuisine, shojin ryori, which was entirely vegetarian and which had its own aesthetic and philosophy. There were vendors of teas and incenses, of pickles and preserved foods, of sweets made according to centuries-old recipes. The market closed at a definite time each day, the shutters coming down in a wave from one end to the other. But there were stories about people who had somehow found themselves in the market late at night, long after it should have been closed. These people described finding it fully operational, with vendors selling their goods, customers shopping and chatting, everything appearing completely normal except for the fact that it was the middle of the night. When these people tried to make purchases or talk to vendors, they would suddenly find themselves outside the market, standing on a dark, empty street, with no memory of how they had gotten there. The geisha districts of Kyoto, particularly Gion, were places of beauty and strict tradition, where arts that had been refined over centuries were still practiced and passed down. The geisha themselves were highly trained entertainers, skilled in traditional dance and music, in conversation and games, in creating an atmosphere of elegance and charm for their clients. The streets of Gion in the evening were magical, with lanterns glowing softly, with the occasional glimpse of a geisha or maiko, an apprentice geisha, hurrying to an appointment in her elaborate kimono and distinctive white makeup. The wooden machiya houses, traditional townhouses with their narrow frontages and deep interiors, gave the district a feeling of having been frozen in time, a pocket of old Kyoto persisting within the modern city. But access to the geisha world was strictly controlled. One could not simply show up and request entertainment. Introductions were required, relationships built over time. The oshaya, the tea houses where geisha entertained, did not serve unknown customers. This exclusivity added to the mystery and allure of the geisha world, making it seem like a secret society with its own rules and rituals. Within the geisha communities there were strict hierarchies and traditions. Young girls who wished to become geisha would enter as maiko around age 15, after completing their regular education. They would be assigned to an older geisha who would serve as their teacher and mentor, guiding them through years of training in dance, shamisen playing, tea ceremony, and all the other arts they would need to master. The maiko were easily identified by their distinctive appearance. They wore more elaborate kimonos than fully fledged geisha, with longer sleeves and brighter colours. Their obi, the wide sash worn with the kimono, was tied in a special trailing style unique to maiko. Their hair was styled in traditional patterns, using their own hair rather than wigs, decorated with elaborate kanzashi, ornamental hairpins that changed with the seasons. Their makeup was stark white with accents of red and black, creating a stylized beauty that was instantly recognizable. The transformation from maiko to geisha was marked by a ceremony called erikai, the turning of the collar. The maiko's red collar would be changed to the white collar of a geisha, symbolizing her graduation and her new status. This was a significant event, celebrated by the entire community, for it represented years of hard work and dedication, finally culminating in full professional status. The performances of geisha were themselves works of art. The traditional dances they performed were slow and subtle, with every gesture laden with meaning. A turn of the head, a flutter of the fan, the particular way the hem of the kimono was moved as the dancer turned, all of these had specific significances that trained observers could read. The dances often told stories, sometimes of ancient legends, sometimes of seasonal beauty, sometimes of romantic longing. The music that accompanied these dances was played on traditional instruments, the shamisen with its distinctive twanging sound, the fiei flute with its breathy tones, the small suzumi drums whose players would call out rhythmic patterns as they struck. The combination of music and dance created performances that were mesmerizing, that transported viewers to another time and place, that seemed to embody the essence of traditional Japanese aesthetic values. But there were mysteries in the geisha world too. There were stories of geisha who had supernatural abilities, who could somehow know things about their clients that they had no normal way of knowing. There were tales of maiko who had died tragically, and whose ghosts still appeared in the district where they had lived and worked, forever young and beautiful in their elaborate costumes. There were accounts of Ochaya where strange things happened, where rooms would become inexplicably cold, where shamisen would sound though no one was playing them, where the scent of flowers would fill the air though no flowers were present. One particularly poignant story concerned a maiko who had fallen in love with the young samurai, a love that was doomed because their social positions made marriage impossible. She had continued to entertain as required, but her heart was not in it, and everyone could see that she was pining away. Finally, the samurai's family had arranged his marriage to an appropriate bride, and when the maiko learned of this, she had walked to the Kamo River and drowned herself. Ever after, or so the story went, her ghost could be seen on certain nights, walking slowly along the riverbank in her maiko finery, her face expressing such sorrow that those who saw her would feel their own hearts breaking. Some said she was still looking for her lost love. Others said she was warning other young women not to make the same mistake she had made. not to let romantic love destroy them. Still others believed she was simply trapped in the moment of her greatest despair, unable to move forward into whatever came after death. The river itself, the Kamo River that flowed through Kyoto, was a presence in the city's life and in its mysteries. During much of the year it was a modest stream, its waters flowing gently between stone embankments, its banks popular spots for people to sit and relax, especially in the cooler evening hours. But during the rainy season, it could transform into a raging torrent, overflowing its banks, flooding the surrounding areas, demonstrating the power and unpredictability of nature. The river had been witness to much of Kyoto's history. Emperors and commoners alike had walked its banks. Lovers had met beside it. Battles had been fought for control of its bridges. Bodies of the dead had been sent downstream on funeral rafts. All of this history, all of these memories, seemed to linger in the air around the river, making it a place where the past felt very present. There were particular spots along the river that were considered spiritually significant or dangerous. There was a place called Turtle Stone, a large rock in the middle of the river that was said to be the dwelling place of a river god. People would leave offerings on this stone, carefully wading out to it during low water to leave their rice or sake or flowers. There was another spot where the water formed a deep pool, and it was whispered that this pool was bottomless, that it led down to some underground realm where spirits dwelt. The bridges that spanned the river were themselves noteworthy, each one with its own history and associations. Some bridges were considered unlucky, places where bad things had happened so often that people avoided them if they could. Others were seen as fortunate, good places for romantic encounters or for business meetings. The Sanjo Bridge was particularly famous, for it had been a gathering place for masterless samurai during certain periods of history, and later it had become a spot where poets and artists would meet to share their work and exchange ideas. The textile industry in Kyoto was another realm where tradition and mystery intertwined. The city had been famous for centuries for the quality of its silk weaving and dyeing, producing fabrics of such beauty and refinement that they were sought after throughout Japan and beyond. The creation of these textiles involved techniques that had been developed and perfected over generations, knowledge that was closely guarded and carefully transmitted from master to apprentice. One of the most distinctive Kyoto textile techniques was Yuzen dyeing, a method of creating elaborate painted designs on silk. The process was incredibly labor-intensive, requiring multiple steps of design, resist application, dyeing, steaming, and washing. The results could be breathtaking, with complex scenes of nature or elegant abstract patterns, rendered in brilliant colours that somehow maintained a sense of refinement and subtlety. The dyers and weavers spoke of their materials with deep respect, treating the silk threads and dyes almost as if they were living things with their own spirits and preferences. They paid attention to weather and temperature, knowing that these factors would affect how dyes took to fabric, how threads behaved on the loom. They made offerings at workshop shrines, asking for the blessing of their work, for the silk to accept the dyes properly, for the weaving to proceed without breaks or flaws. There were stories in the textile workshops too, tales of master craftspeople who had achieved such skill that they seemed to have supernatural abilities. There was an account of a dyer who could match any colour perfectly after seeing it just once, who could mix dyes to create shades that no one else could replicate. There was a tale of a weaver whose fabrics were said to bring good fortune to those who wore them, whose robes had protected samurai in battle and brought success to merchants in business. And there was a darker story about a workshop where a young apprentice had died, killed in an accident with the heavy equipment used to prepare silk thread. After his death, the machines in that workshop began to malfunction, breaking threads, producing uneven dyeing, creating flaws where there should have been none. The master of the workshop finally realized that the dead apprentice's spirit was angry, feeling that his death had not been properly acknowledged or mourned. A Buddhist priest was called in to perform ceremonies for the departed spirit, and offerings were made at the workshop shrine. The other apprentices gathered to share memories of their lost companion, speaking of his kindness and his dedication to learning the craft. Only after all this was done did the mysterious malfunctions cease, and the workshop could return to normal operation, though a small altar was maintained in the apprentice's memory, and offerings were left there on the anniversary of his death each year. The scholars and poets of Kyoto created another layer of the city's intellectual and spiritual life. These were people dedicated to learning, to the study of classical texts, to the composition of poetry that would capture moments of beauty or insight in words that seemed to transcend the merely personal and speak to universal truths. The practice of poetry composition in Kyoto was governed by complex rules and conventions. There were different forms of poetry, each with its own requirements. The tanka form required exactly 31 syllables arranged in a pattern of 5-7-5-7-7. The renga form involved multiple poets taking turns composing alternating verses, each verse responding to and building on what had come before. The haiku form, which would become so famous in later centuries, was just emerging during the period of Imperial Kyoto, representing a crystallization of the aesthetic of capturing profound moments in the fewest possible words. But beyond the technical requirements, there were also expectations about content and tone. Poetry should make reference to the natural world, to the changing seasons, to phenomena like the moon, cherry blossoms, snow, autumn leaves. It should be sophisticated but not ostentatious, displaying learning while seeming effortless. It should convey emotion indirectly, through suggestion and implication rather than direct statement. And it should be aware of the great tradition of poetry that had come before, sometimes alluding to or playing off of famous earlier poems. The scholars studied the Chinese classics, massive texts of philosophy, history and poetry that required years to master. They could write in classical Chinese as well as Japanese, moving fluidly between the two languages, each of which had its own aesthetic and its own appropriate uses. They served as advisors to the nobility, as teachers to young nobles, as administrators helping to run the complex machinery of government and ritual that kept the Imperial Court functioning. But scholars too had their mysterious experiences and their engagement with the unseen world. There were accounts of scholars who had dreams in which the spirits of ancient sages appeared to them, offering guidance or clarification on difficult passages in classical texts. There were stories of poets who had composed verses in states of inspiration that they could not later explain, as if the poems had come through them rather than from them. There were tales of libraries where strange things occurred, where books would be found open to particular pages though no one had opened them, where scrolls would unroll themselves, revealing texts that provided answers to questions the scholar had been pondering. The relationship between written language and spiritual power was deeply embedded in Japanese culture. Characters themselves were believed to have power, particularly when written by skilled calligraphers or when they represented sacred concepts. Talismans and protective charms were covered in characters that combined linguistic meaning with visual power, creating objects that were simultaneously readable texts and magical instruments. The practice of copying sutras, Buddhist sacred texts, was understood to be both a devotional act and a form of meditation. The copyist would prepare carefully, purifying themselves, setting up a clean workspace, grinding fresh ink. Then they would begin to copy, writing each character with full attention and respect, understanding that they were not just reproducing a text, but participating in the transmission of the Dharma, connecting themselves to an unbroken line stretching back to the Buddha himself. Some people copied sutras as a prayer for specific intentions, for the health of a loved one, for the repose of someone who had died, for their own spiritual development. The finished copy might be deposited in a temple repository, adding to the vast collection of handwritten sutras that these institutions maintained. Or it might be kept as a personal treasure, a reminder of the time and effort invested in creating it, a physical embodiment of one's spiritual aspiration. The very act of writing could be a spiritual practice, not just in copying sutras, but in any kind of careful, attentive calligraphy. The Zen tradition particularly emphasized this, teaching that the state of mind of the calligrapher was visible in their brushwork, that to create beautiful characters required quieting the mind and entering a state of full presence. The greatest calligraphers were often also spiritual masters, and their works were treasured not just for their visual beauty, but for what they revealed about the state of enlightenment. As our story of the mysterious side of life in Imperial Kyoto draws toward its close, we find ourselves with a deeper understanding of how the people of that ancient city inhabited a world that was simultaneously practical and magical, orderly and mysterious, beautiful and strange. They lived lives governed by complex social hierarchies and elaborate rituals, yet they remained always aware that beneath and beyond all of this surface structure, there flowed currents of meaning and power that could not be fully controlled or completely understood. The mysterious dimension was not separate from daily life, but woven through every aspect of it. It was there in the morning offerings at household altars, in the way people greeted the new day with gratitude and prayers. It was there in the work of artisans who treated their materials with respect and who understood their crafts as forms of devotion. It was there in the festivals that marked the turning of the seasons, connecting the present to the deep past and to the eternal cycles of nature. It was there in the temples where monks chanted sutras, their voices creating a sonic space that seemed to open onto other dimensions of reality. It was there in the shrines where ordinary people came with their hopes and fears, their gratitude and their desperate needs, trusting that the kami heard them and cared about their lives. It was there in the gardens where careful human artifice created scenes of natural beauty that inspired contemplation and wonder. It was there in the stories told and retold, the legends of ghosts and spirits, of magical transformations and supernatural interventions, of moments when the boundary between worlds dissolved and something from beyond came through. These stories were not lies or mere entertainment. They were ways of encoding and transmitting understanding about the nature of reality, about the limits of ordinary perception, about the mysterious depths that underlie surface appearances. The people of Imperial Kyoto understood that mystery was not something to be solved or eliminated, but something to be respected and honored. They knew that there were questions that could not be answered, experiences that could not be explained, dimensions of reality that would always remain beyond the reach of rational understanding. But rather than finding this frightening or frustrating, they found it liberating and enriching, making life deeper and more meaningful than it would have been if everything were known and explained. This openness to mystery shaped their arts and practices in profound ways. Their poetry captured moments of beauty and insight, while always leaving room for interpretation and imagination. Their gardens created spaces that were simultaneously natural and artificial, inviting contemplation of the relationship between human intention and natural process. Their rituals connected them to forces larger than themselves, while also providing structure and meaning to the flow of time. And always, underlying everything, was the awareness of impermanence, the recognition that all things change and pass away. The cherry blossoms bloomed and fell. The seasons turned their endless wheel. Generations were born, lived their lives and died, replaced by new generations who would walk the same streets, worship at the same temples, tell variations of the same stories. This awareness of transience, rather than making life seem pointless or sad, actually made every moment more precious, every experience more vivid, every relationship more meaningful. For if everything was temporary, then nothing could be taken for granted. The beauty of the autumn moon had to be appreciated fully in this moment, knowing that this particular autumn, this particular moon, would never come again. The time with loved ones had to be treasured, knowing that all relationships eventually ended in separation. The opportunity to see beauty, to create art, to practice compassion, to seek understanding, all of these had to be embraced with full presence and commitment, for there was no guarantee of future chances. This was perhaps the deepest wisdom that the mysterious side of life in Imperial Kyoto had to offer. Not answers to our questions, but a way of living with questions. Not certainty about what happens after death, but a way of making peace with uncertainty. Not control over the forces that shape our lives, but a way of moving gracefully through circumstances we cannot control. Not escape from suffering, but a way of finding meaning and beauty even in the midst of difficulty. The lanterns still glowed in the darkness, as they had glowed for 1,000 years, their light a testament to human persistence and hope. The temple still stood, their wooden halls and soaring roofs sheltering practices and teachings that had been passed down through countless generations. The gardens still invited contemplation, their carefully placed stones and thoughtfully pruned trees creating spaces where the heart could rest and the mind could settle. And somewhere in the quiet hours of the night, when even the busiest city grows still, the boundary between worlds still grows thin. The spirits still walk their ancient paths. The dead still visit those they loved. The gods still hear the prayers that rise like incense smoke toward the heavens. The mysterious dimension of existence still reveals itself to those who have eyes to see and hearts to understand. This is the gift that Imperial Kyoto offers to us across the centuries. Not just its beautiful buildings and exquisite arts, though these are precious enough, but something deeper, a way of understanding our place in the universe, a way of honouring the mystery that surrounds us, a way of living that recognises both the wonder and the sorrow of existence and finds room for both, holding them together in a unity that is itself a kind of teaching, a kind of truth that cannot be spoken but only lived and felt and passed on through story and ritual, and the quiet transmission of wisdom from generation to generation across the flowing river of time. The physicians and healers of Imperial Kyoto practiced their arts with an understanding that illness and health were not purely physical phenomena, but involved the whole person, body and spirit, and indeed involved the person's relationship with the cosmos itself. They studied the flow of Kai, vital energy, through the body's meridians. They understood how the 5 elements, wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, corresponded to organs and emotions and seasons. They knew which herbs would cool a fever, which would calm an agitated mind, which would strengthen the blood or ease the pain of old injuries. But they also knew that some illnesses had supernatural causes. A persistent fever that would not respond to ordinary treatment might be the result of a curse or possession. Dreams that tormented someone night after night might indicate that an ancestral spirit was trying to communicate something important. A wasting illness with no clear physical cause might mean that the person's soul had been stolen by a malevolent entity, or that they were being visited by a vengeful ghost. In such cases, the physician would work together with religious specialists. A Shinto priest might perform purification rituals. A Buddhist monk might chant specific sutras known to calm troubled spirits. An onmyoji might create protective talismans or divine the source of the supernatural influence. The treatment would address both the physical symptoms and their underlying spiritual cause, recognizing that true healing required attending to all dimensions of the person. There were healing springs and sacred wells throughout Kyoto and its surrounding mountains, places where the water was believed to have special curative properties. People would make pilgrimages to these sites, drinking the water or bathing in it, praying for healing as they did so. Some of these places had been recognized as sacred for centuries, perhaps even before Buddhism came to Japan. The water itself was understood to be a gift from the kami, or from enlightened beings who had blessed it for the benefit of all. One such place was a mountain spring that was said to cure eye diseases. The water from this spring was crystal clear and icy cold even in summer, emerging from deep within the earth. People who drank from it or washed their eyes with it reported remarkable improvements in their vision, some claiming that they could see clearly for the first time in years. Whether this was due to some mineral content in the water, or to faith and the power of ritual, or to genuine supernatural intervention was debatable. But the spring continued to draw visitors who testified to its effectiveness. The cuisine of Kyoto was another expression of the city's refined aesthetic sensibility and its deep connection to the natural world and the rhythms of the seasons. The preparation and presentation of food were elevated to art forms, with attention paid not just to flavour, but to colour, texture, arrangement, and seasonal appropriateness. A meal prepared by a skilled Kyoto chef was a multi-sensory experience, a meditation on the gifts of nature and the skills of the craftsperson who had transformed raw ingredients into something both nourishing and beautiful. The kaiseki meal, which developed in connection with the tea ceremony, exemplified this approach. This was a series of small, carefully prepared dishes, each one showcasing seasonal ingredients, each one presented with exquisite attention to detail. The courses followed a specific order, from lighter flavours to richer ones, from raw to cooked, creating a journey through tastes and textures that was meant to be savoured slowly, with full attention to each element. The vessels in which food was served were chosen with as much care as the food itself. The bowls and plates were often works of art in themselves, ceramics by famous potters, lacquerware decorated with gold, simple bamboo containers that complemented rustic dishes. The selection of vessels took into account not just aesthetics, but also how they would harmonise with the food, how they would feel in the hand, how they would enhance the entire experience of the meal. But beyond the refined cuisine of the nobles and the wealthy, there was also the everyday food of ordinary people, and this too had its own beauty and meaning. The simple rice and miso soup that were staples of the Japanese diet were prepared with care and eaten with gratitude. Before each meal, people would pause to give thanks, acknowledging the many beings and forces that had made this food possible, from the farmers who had grown the rice to the sun and rain that had nourished it to the kami and Buddhas whose blessings sustained all life. The seasonal foods of Kyoto were eagerly anticipated and deeply appreciated. In spring there were bamboo shoots and wild mountain vegetables, fresh green flavours that spoke of renewal and growth. In summer there were cucumbers and eggplants, cooling foods appropriate to the heat. In autumn, there were chestnuts and persimmons, mushrooms and sweet potatoes, foods that were warming and sustaining as the weather cooled. In winter, there were root vegetables and preserved foods, the last harvest from the autumn gardens combined with pickles and dried fish that had been prepared to last through the cold months. The preparation of these seasonal foods often involves specific techniques and traditions. The making of mochi, pounded rice cakes, was a communal activity that took place at the end of the year, with family members taking turns swinging the heavy mallets that pounded cooked rice into a smooth, sticky mass. The pickling of vegetables followed recipes that had been passed down through generations, each family having its own particular way of preparing the cucumbers or radishes or cabbage, its own preferred balance of salt and rice, bran and other ingredients. Even tea, that most essential of Kyoto beverages, had its mysteries and its depths. The tea ceremony had elevated the drinking of tea into a spiritual practice, but even outside the formal ceremony, the preparation and drinking of tea was treated with respect and attention. The water had to be heated to exactly the right temperature. The tea leaves had to be of good quality and properly stored. The way the tea was whisked or steeped affected its flavour and its appearance. And the drinking of tea was an opportunity to pause in the middle of a busy day, to appreciate something simple and beautiful, to take a moment of quiet in the midst of activity. There were stories about tea too, stories of legendary tea masters who had achieved such refined taste that they could identify the exact location where tea leaves had been grown just by tasting the tea made from them. There were tales of tea gatherings that had become transcendent experiences, where all the participants had simultaneously entered a state of profound peace and clarity. There were accounts of tea bowls that seemed to enhance the flavour of any tea drunk from them, as if the bowl itself contributed something beyond its physical form. The clothing of Imperial Kyoto, particularly the elaborate robes of the nobles, was another realm where aesthetics and meaning intertwined. The layering of different coloured silks to create harmonious or dramatic effects required deep knowledge of colour theory and seasonal appropriateness. The combinations had poetic names that referenced classical literature and natural phenomena. To be dressed properly was to be a walking work of art, to embody cultural knowledge and aesthetic sensitivity. The creation of these garments required extraordinary skill and labour. The silk had to be woven, often in complex patterns. It had to be dyed, sometimes with multiple colours creating gradations and shadings. It had to be cut and sewn with precision, for the robes were constructed without the body-fitting techniques used in Western clothing, relying instead on the draping and layering of rectangular panels of fabric to create their effect. The dyeing techniques used in Kyoto were particularly sophisticated, capable of producing effects that seemed almost magical. There was tie-dyeing that created intricate patterns of reserved areas and dyed areas. There was paste-resist dyeing that allowed for complex painted designs. There was ikat weaving where the threads were dyed before being woven, creating softly blurred patterns. Each of these techniques had been refined over centuries, with masters developing their own particular approaches and passing their knowledge to carefully chosen apprentices. The wearing of these beautiful robes was itself governed by complex rules and expectations. Certain colours were reserved for the imperial family. Certain patterns were appropriate only for specific ranks or occasions. The way the robes were worn, how many layers, which colours in which order, all of this communicated information about the wearer's status, education, and understanding of protocol. To dress improperly was to commit a social error that could have serious consequences, but there was also creativity and personal expression within these constraints. A woman with exceptional taste could create combinations that were surprising yet appropriate, that demonstrated her knowledge of tradition while also showing her individual sensibility. A man might choose subtle variations in the draping of his robes or in the accessories he wore that would be noticed and appreciated by those with discerning eyes. The connection between clothing and identity went beyond mere social signalling. The robes one wore were understood to affect how one felt and acted. To dress formally was to feel more formal, to conduct oneself with greater dignity and restraint. To wear the simple robes of a monk was to step into a different way of being, to shed the attachments and concerns of ordinary life. The transformation was not just external, but internal, the clothing helping to create the state of mind appropriate to the role being assumed. There were even beliefs that clothing could retain something of the essence of the person who had worn it. The robes of a holy person might be treasured as relics, believed to carry blessings or protective power. The clothing of someone who had died might be carefully disposed of or ritually purified before being worn by someone else, for fear that the deceased person's spirit might cling to the fabric. And there were stories of ghostly figures appearing in distinctive clothing, their robes allowing them to be identified even when their faces could not be clearly seen. The music of Kyoto extended beyond the refined performances of court nobles and professional musicians to encompass all the sounds that filled the city. There was the rhythmic sound of wooden clappers announcing performances or ceremonies. There was the calling of street vendors, their cries becoming a kind of urban music, identifying what they were selling while also creating the soundscape of the neighborhoods. There was the splash of water from fountains and the rustle of leaves in the wind, natural sounds that were appreciated as musical elements in the garden's composition. The bells that rang from temples throughout the day and night created a sonic architecture for the city, marking time but also creating a sense of continuity and connection. The deep resonance of a temple bell could be heard for miles, its sound waves spreading out across the city, touching everyone who heard it, creating a moment of shared experience even among people who were otherwise strangers to one another. During festivals, the soundscape changed dramatically. There would be the rhythmic chanting of men pulling the festival floats. There would be the sounds of traditional festival music, flutes and drums creating patterns that had been played for centuries. There would be the calls of food vendors and game operators. There would be children's laughter and excited conversation. There would be the sound of thousands of feet on cobblestones as people moved through the streets in celebration. But perhaps the most mysterious sounds in Kyoto were those that could not be clearly identified or explained. The sounds heard in the deep night when the city was supposed to be asleep. The strange cries that came from the mountains. The music that seemed to have no source. The voices that spoke when no one was there. These sounds were part of the mysterious dimension of the city, reminders that reality extended beyond what could be easily understood or explained. The practice of divination in Kyoto took many forms, from the sophisticated cosmological calculations of the onmyoji to the simple fortune-telling done by street practitioners. People wanted to know what the future held, whether their planned actions would succeed or fail, whether the person they loved returned their feelings, whether they should proceed with a business venture or look for different opportunities. The onmyoji used complex systems based on Chinese cosmology, calculating the relationships between the 5 elements, the 12 animals of the zodiac, the positions of stars and planets, and various other factors. They could determine auspicious and inauspicious days for different activities. They could divine the causes of misfortune and prescribe remedies. They could predict larger patterns, warning of coming disasters or identifying opportune moments for important decisions. But there were also simpler forms of divination. There was the practice of drawing fortune slips at shrines and temples, thin strips of paper with predictions or advice written on them. If the fortune was good, people would keep the slip as a talisman. If it was bad, they would tie it to a designated tree or rack at the shrine, believing that leaving it there would prevent the bad fortune from following them. There was the reading of dreams, with certain dream symbols understood to have specific meanings. Dreams of snakes might indicate coming wealth or hidden danger depending on the details. Dreams of flying might suggest spiritual progress or loss of grounding. Dreams of deceased loved ones might carry messages or warnings that needed to be heeded. There was the observation of omens in daily life. The behavior of animals could be significant. The way smoke rose from a fire. The patterns formed by tea leaves in a cup. Unexpected events or coincidences that seemed too meaningful to be merely random. All of these might be read as signs, as communications from the unseen world about matters that could not be known through ordinary means. The accuracy of these various divination methods was debatable. Some predictions proved true, others did not. But the practice of divination served purposes beyond simple fortune-telling. It provided a way of thinking through decisions, of considering factors that might otherwise be overlooked. It offered comfort in uncertain situations, a sense that there was some way to gain insight into the unknown future. And it maintained awareness of the mysterious dimension of existence, the recognition that human knowledge and control were limited, and that there were forces and patterns operating beyond ordinary perception. The education of children in Imperial Kyoto began in the home and continued through formal study, with the specific content and methods depending on the child's social class and gender. Children of noble families received extensive education in classical learning, in the arts, in the complex rules of etiquette and protocol that would govern their adult lives. They studied Chinese classics, learned to write in classical Chinese as well as Japanese, practiced calligraphy until their brushwork was fluid and confident. They also received education in less tangible things, in aesthetic sensitivity, in the ability to appreciate and create beauty, in the development of character and proper behavior. They learned by observation and imitation, watching their elders and modeling their own behavior on what they saw. They learned through stories and poetry, absorbing values and understandings that were conveyed indirectly through narrative and metaphor. The education of girls focused particularly on accomplishments that would make them good wives and mothers, refined companions capable of managing complex households and maintaining the family's cultural standards. They learned needlework and the arts of kimono selection and coordination. They learned music and dance. They studied poetry and the classics of Japanese literature. They were trained in all the social graces, in how to move and speak and present themselves in ways that demonstrated their cultivation and refinement. But education was not just about practical skills or social polish. It was also about transmitting the culture's understanding of reality, including its mysterious dimensions. Children learned about the kami and the Buddhas, about ghosts and spirits, about proper behavior toward the unseen world. They learned the rituals and observances that structured the year. They learned to pay attention to signs and omens, to respect sacred places, to approach the world with awareness that it contained more than what was immediately visible. The stories told to children played a particularly important role in this education. There were fairy tales about clever animals and magical transformations. There were moral tales about children who were rewarded for their kindness or punished for their disobedience. There were ghost stories meant to thrill and frighten, but also to teach caution and respect. There were legends about heroes and heroines, about historical figures who exemplified particular virtues or whose lives illustrated important truths. These stories were not presented as mere entertainment, but as carriers of wisdom and understanding. The children who heard them were expected to learn from them, to think about what the stories meant, to apply their lessons to their own lives. And because the stories often involved the mysterious and supernatural, they helped children develop a worldview in which such elements were accepted as natural parts of reality, rather than as impossible fantasies. As children grew into adolescence and then adulthood, their education continued, though in different forms. Young nobles might serve at court, learning practical skills of administration and diplomacy. They might study under famous teachers, deepening their understanding of philosophy or poetry or military strategy. They might undertake religious training, spending time at temples or shrines, studying sacred texts and engaging in spiritual practices. Young people from other classes had their own forms of continuing education. An apprentice learning a craft would spend years mastering increasingly complex techniques, eventually reaching a level of skill where they could work independently or even innovate within their tradition. A merchant's child would learn the family business, understanding not just the practical aspects of buying and selling, but also the relationships and reputations that were essential to success. And throughout all of this formal and informal education, the mysterious dimension of a life in Kyoto remained present. The student who stayed up late studying might hear strange sounds in the quiet night. The apprentice working in a master's studio might have experiences that could not be easily explained. The young person serving at court might glimpse something that challenged their understanding of reality. These experiences were part of the ongoing education, teaching humility and wonder, maintaining awareness that human knowledge was always incomplete, and that the universe held depths that could never be fully plumbed. The aging and death of individuals in Imperial Kyoto were understood as natural processes, part of the endless cycle of birth and death and rebirth that Buddhist teachings described. But they were also times of transition and vulnerability, moments when the boundary between life and death grew thin and special care was needed. As people aged, they were treated with increasing respect and deference. The elderly were understood to have accumulated wisdom through their long experience. They had survived wars and disasters, had seen many changes, had learned lessons that only time could teach. Their memories connected the present to the past, making them living repositories of family and cultural history. But old age also brought infirmity and dependence, and the care of elderly family members was seen as a sacred duty. Children and grandchildren would tend to the needs of the elderly, ensuring their comfort, listening to their stories, seeking their advice. This care was understood as a way of honouring one's ancestors, for the elderly were approaching the time when they themselves would join the ancestors and deserve the same reverence. When death approached, specific rituals and preparations would begin. A Buddhist priest might be called to perform last rites, helping the dying person to maintain clarity of mind and to focus on spiritual practice even as the body failed. Family members would gather, keeping vigil, ensuring that the person did not die alone. There was a belief that the state of mind at the moment of death was particularly important, influencing the nature of the next rebirth, so efforts were made to create a peaceful, spiritually supportive atmosphere. After death, the body would be ritually washed and dressed in white burial garments. Offerings would be made, and prayers would be said. The funeral itself might be an elaborate affair, particularly for nobles or wealthy merchants, with many monks chanting sutras, with processions and ceremonies extending over multiple days. Or it might be a simpler event, but still conducted with proper ritual and respect. The body would typically be cremated, and the ashes would be interred in a family grave or at a temple. The funeral would be followed by a series of memorial services at specified intervals: the 7th day, the 49th day, the 100th day, and then annually thereafter. These memorial services were believed to help the deceased in their journey through the intermediate state between death and rebirth, transferring merit to them and helping them to achieve a favourable rebirth. But alongside these formal Buddhist practices, there were also more personal and immediate ways that the living maintained connection with the dead. Family altars where offerings were made daily, visits to graves to clean and tend them, to speak to the departed, to maintain the physical connection even though the person was gone, the telling of stories about the deceased, keeping their memory alive in the family's consciousness. And sometimes there were encounters that suggested the dead were not as far away as it might seem, a dream that felt too vivid and meaningful to be merely a product of the sleeping mind, a sense of presence, of being watched over or guided, a coincidence that seemed like an answer to a prayer or question directed to the departed. These experiences were accepted as real, as evidence that the bonds between the living and dead continued, that death transformed but did not sever the relationships that had mattered in life. This cycle of the year in Imperial Kyoto was marked by numerous observances and festivals, creating a rhythm that connected people to the natural world, to their ancestors, to the larger community, and to the divine. Each month had its own character and its own special days. Some of these observances were grand public events, others were quiet family rituals, but all of them contributed to the sense that time was not merely linear but cyclical, that the year was not just a sequence of days but a meaningful pattern of celebration and reflection, of gratitude and renewal. The New Year celebrations were among the most important, a time when everything was renewed and purified. Houses were thoroughly cleaned, old debts were paid, quarrels were resolved. Special foods were prepared, particularly mochi rice cakes and special vegetable dishes called osechi. The first shrine visit of the new year was made, with people going to their neighbourhood shrine or to one of the great shrines of the city to pray for health, prosperity, and happiness in the coming year. The New Year period was also a time when the boundary between worlds was believed to be particularly open. Ancestors were especially welcome to visit, and offerings were left for them at family altars. Children received special envelopes with money, and they were told to be on their best behaviour because the kami were watching closely at this important time of transition. As the year progressed, other festivals and observances followed. The Setsubun ceremony in early February, when beans were thrown to drive away demons and welcome spring. The Doll Festival in March, when families with daughters would display elaborate sets of dolls representing the Imperial Court. The Boys' Festival in May, when families with sons would fly carp-shaped banners to symbolize strength and perseverance. The Tanabata Festival in July celebrated the legend of two stars, represented as lovers, who could meet only once a year. People would write wishes on strips of paper and hang them on bamboo branches, hoping that their wishes would be granted. The Obon Festival in late summer honoured the ancestors, with lanterns lit to guide their spirits home for a brief visit. The moon viewing celebrations in autumn were times of quiet contemplation, when people gathered to admire the full moon and compose poetry in its honour. The autumn equinox was another time for memorial services, when people would visit family graves and make offerings to the dead. As winter approached, there were festivals of thanksgiving for the harvest, ceremonies of purification and preparation for the cold months ahead. And then the year would come full circle, back to the New Year preparations, and the cycle would begin again. Each of these festivals and observances had its own rituals and meanings, its own special foods and activities. but they all shared certain characteristics. They mark time as meaningful rather than merely linear. They connected the present to the past and to the future. They acknowledged the relationship between humans and nature, between the living and the dead, between the earthly realm and the divine. And they created community, bringing people together in shared celebration and observance, reinforcing social bonds and collective identity. The mysterious dimension of existence was woven throughout all of these celebrations. The beans thrown at Setsubun were not just symbols but were believed to have actual power to drive away evil influences. The dolls displayed at the Doll Festival were not just decorations, but were understood to absorb negative energies, protecting the girls in the household. The lanterns lit at Obon were not just pretty lights, but were actual guides for the spirits of the dead, helping them find their way home. This interweaving of the practical and the mystical, the material and the spiritual, was characteristic of life in Imperial Kyoto. There was no sharp division between these realms. A garden was simultaneously a beautiful physical space and a representation of cosmological principles. A meal was simultaneously nourishment for the body and an offering to the gods and ancestors. A poem was simultaneously an arrangement of words and a manifestation of the invisible patterns that structured reality. To live in this way required a particular kind of awareness, a capacity to hold multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. It required being fully present to the immediate physical reality while also being aware of its deeper dimensions. It required practical competence in the affairs of daily life combined with openness to mystery and wonder. It required both grounding in tradition and willingness to have direct experiences that might challenge conventional understanding. The people of Imperial Kyoto cultivated this multidimensional awareness through all the practices and observances we have described. Through poetry and art, through ritual and ceremony, through attention to the natural world and to the changing seasons, through stories and teachings passed down through generations, they developed a way of being in the world that was rich and complex, grounded and transcendent, practical and mystical all at once. And this way of being was not separate from the mysterious dimension, but was actually a product of it. Because the people of Kyoto recognized that reality was larger and stranger than ordinary perception revealed, they approached life with humility and wonder. Because they acknowledged forces beyond human control, they developed practices to harmonize with those forces rather than simply trying to dominate them. Because they accepted that some questions had no final answers, they learned to live gracefully with uncertainty and ambiguity. The wisdom that emerged from this way of life was profound and subtle. It cannot be reduced to simple formulas or explicit teachings. It is embodied in practices and expressed through arts, transmitted through story and example, rather than through abstract doctrine. But its essential message was clear. Life is mysterious. Reality is deeper than appearance, and the appropriate response to this recognition is not fear or denial, but openness, reverence, and wonder. This wisdom speaks to us still, across the centuries that separate our time from Imperial Kyoto. The specific practices and beliefs of that culture may seem strange or even incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. The social hierarchies seem unjust. The supernatural beliefs seem superstitious. The rituals seem excessive or empty. But beneath these surface differences there is something that remains relevant and valuable. The recognition that we live in a mysterious universe. The understanding that beauty and meaning are not luxuries but necessities. The awareness that we are connected to something larger than our individual selves. The acceptance that some aspects of existence will always remain beyond our grasp, and that this is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be acknowledged and honoured. Imperial Kyoto, with all its beauty and all its mysteries, with its exquisite arts and its shadowy corners, with its elaborate rituals and its ghostly encounters, with its cherry blossoms and its temple bells, with its poetry and its spirits, offers us a vision of what it means to live in full awareness of the mysterious dimension of existence. It shows us that such awareness does not lead to confusion or paralysis, but can actually enrich life, making it deeper and more meaningful, more connected and more free. And so, as this long story draws to its close, we find ourselves standing once again in that ancient city, in the quiet gardens where the moss grows thick and the stone lanterns cast their gentle light, in the temple halls where incense smoke rises and sutras are chanted, in the streets where lanterns glow and shadows dance. We find ourselves in the presence of something that cannot quite be named but can be felt and known, something that whispers of depths beneath the surface, of connections invisible but real, of meanings that transcend words. The mysterious side of life in Imperial Kyoto was not an addition to ordinary existence, but was woven through its very fabric. It was there in every moment, in every place, in every experience. It was as natural as breathing, as constant as the beating of the heart, and it made life not frightening or uncertain, but magical and meaningful, filled with possibility and grace, connected to the deep wellsprings of existence from which all beauty and wisdom flow, held always in the embrace of mystery that gives life its ultimate significance and its unending wonder.